It seems like just yesterday when you heard something from, let's say, a medical professional, you thought, well, it's probably reasonable to assume that whatever they're telling me is accurate and good for me and something that I should do. If you would have asked me, I don't know, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago about vaccines, I would be like, well, yes, of course, they're wonderful and get as many as you can as early as possible. If you would have talked about the food supply, I would have been like, what's all this crap about all this organic stuff and everything? The bottom line is that 10 years ago, I would have thought, well, yeah, these people can generally be trusted in the things that they tell me. And then COVID hit. And all of a sudden, we got a window into institutions which most of us thought we could trust and now just don't trust anymore, at least not to the extent that we used to, if at all, for some people. And what this means is we're no longer just questioning the stuff that we see put out by pharmaceutical companies or by government officials or experts within the university system. We're starting to question huge swaths of our own history on whether or not we've been lied to about the things that really matter. When it comes to our actual historical narrative for who we are as a people, we're starting to see a lot of people on the right question things that, again, 10 years ago just were beyond the realm of questioning. It just was what it was. This was part of our overall historical narrative. It helped define who we were and what we thought about ourselves and where we were going as a country, what to do, what to emulate, what to avoid, what to despise, what to fight. All of it was built into these various culturally shaping institutions. And ever since COVID, a larger sector of the population, to include a sector on the right, is now questioning that. Now, you could argue that the left has always been skeptical of that narrative, and they've had their various reasons for that skepticism. But the right generally said that nobody's perfect, and while none of these institutions are flawless or infallible, they're generally to be trusted, and therefore the historical narratives of the various advice that they give us, whether it be medical or health or whatnot, can be trusted. Well, it's not the case anymore. And now we're starting to see a whole ration of right-wing revisionism of history. Now, here's what I would say right off the bat. I remember growing up where whenever we heard revisionist history, it was usually a critique of something the left was saying, where they were taking something that Americans generally trusted about ourselves and they were questioning it, usually the denigration of the United States. And so there was a lot of rebellion against it. But lately, it's the right questioning those historical narratives. And so today we're going to look at 3 historical narratives that the right is starting to look back and question. And we're going to talk about the implications for this. Why is it happening? Why are we doing it? Is there any place for it? And if so, what is the right way to actually engage in a revisionist look at history that can give us a better, more comprehensive understanding of what happened so that theoretically we can actually get to the truth, not just what we wish was true, but the actual truth, so that hopefully we can make better decisions going forward. I'm your host, Nick Freitas. With me in the studio, my beautiful bride, Tina, the Queen of the Bees.
Hello, everyone.
And then, of course, we have our resident historian, political prognosticator, the Oracle of Virginia, Christian Hines. How you doing, Christian?
I'm really excited for this episode.
I think this one's going to be good. I'll tell you, before we get into all the things that you can't trust and why, I'll tell you what you can trust, and that's Good Ranchers. That's right. Good Ranchers has a 100% American supply chain, and they don't put any crap in your food. Some of the crap that we were just talking about a moment ago. Now, Nick, you're saying, but if I go to the store, I see product of the USA when I see the meat I buy. Yeah, that's because politicians have decided that you can throw that little American product of the USA label on things that, well, let's just say probably don't meet your definition of what a product of the USA should be. Like, for instance, if it's been in a feedlot in a foreign country and then brought over to the United States, gone through minimal processing and is now called a product of the USA, that's probably not what you're looking for. But if you want to make sure that you are actually getting a legitimate, no kidding, 100% American piece of beef, poultry, pork, wild-caught seafood, Good Ranchers is where you want to go. And guess what? If you go to goodranchers.com right now and use my exclusive code NICK, right? So as you're going through and you're checking out all you want, you put in Nick, you're going to get free meat with your subscription and $40 off your order. Guys, it's summertime. We need to be going out there and barbecuing. And Good Ranchers is a great way to do that. Good Ranchers is not just someone we recommend because they sponsor the show. It's someone that we have been eating Good Ranchers now for a while, for a minute. And we absolutely love it, not to mention the fact that it is a company run by wonderful people. So if you want to support the show, if you want to support them, good American company, and you want to support yourself, go to goodranchers.com, use my code Nick, and get a great deal over the summer. All right.
Everybody can always use more meat.
Oh my God.
Because it's your deal has extra meat.
There she goes.
Free meat.
All right. So let's go ahead and do what we do. We're going to frame the argument that we're about to make. So it's important to understand that the post-war consensus has informed most of us about what we're to think about the world. And when we say the post-war, we're talking about post-World War II. And that's because World War II kind of ended up in the American psyche and really in the psyche of much of the West has been kind of this existential fight of good versus evil. And good triumphed over evil. So what was good? Well, good was the Allies. And what was evil? Well, evil was the Nazis and the fascists and the Imperial Japanese because they were committing atrocities and they engaged in the Holocaust and they did all these horrible things. And the last thing you want to be compared to is a fascist or a Nazi because fascists and Nazis are racist. They're militaristic. They're overly nationalistic. They're just bad guys, right? They're just bad guys. Whereas the Allies were the representatives of a free and open society of representative government. So you see the lines being drawn right now, authoritarian or totalitarian, being free and open. And this was the narrative. This was the narrative. And what ended up happening is within any narrative, you have examples or you have icons. So the personification of evil is Hitler, right? And the personification of good is this idea of the Allies or openness more specifically. And now, and again, I would say that most people on the right kind of accepted this. But what we saw over time was the left would consistently use these icons of evil, fascism, Nazism, Hitler, to describe anyone they disagreed with, right? Mitt Romney was a fascist, right? And so for a while, you had people think, well, maybe they're only calling the most extreme versions of right-wing, conservatives or whatever. No, it was pretty much anybody on the right. If you didn't agree with them, well, then you were a fascist. And we saw this especially after COVID, where all of a sudden, if you wanted to work out at home, that was fascist. If you wanted to eat right or you wanted to eat red meat, that was, white supremacy. Everything got labeled with this moniker. And so it's kind of natural. It's kind of natural now for people to go, well, wait a second. I don't think I'm any of the things you keep calling me. And no matter how many arguments I make or no matter what evidence I bring to bear to suggest that, well, no, that's not an accurate representation of who I am or what I believe, you keep calling me that for the purpose of shutting down debate. Maybe I should reevaluate what I thought I knew about these various periods of history. Maybe I should rethink it. If I don't like you, if there's one thing I know, it's I don't want woke neo-Marxists trying to trans my kids or abort kids at 9 months. If I don't want drag queen story hour and that's what you represent and you keep calling me these things, well, maybe I need to reevaluate whether or not those things were bad. That seems to be what's taking place right now. And we see this manifested in a couple different ways. Perhaps the most obvious as of late was the interview that Daryl Cooper did with Tucker Carlson. And Joe Rogan, where Daryl Cooper was essentially going back and challenging the post-World War II narrative. And he wasn't just challenging it from the perspective of, hey guys, we did some bad things too, right? Like we firebombed Dresden. Or look at the fact that the Soviet Union took over half of Europe after World War II. How can you say we won? No, Daryl Cooper's going back and saying Winston Churchill is the primary evil figure of World War II, not Hitler. That's a pretty big departure. We're also seeing this with things like the Spanish Civil War. Was Franco the bad guy? Because the popular narrative post-World War II is Franco was the fascist that got away, right? We got Hitler, we got Mussolini, but that Franco decided to cozy up to the West after World War II because he was anti-communist. And so we let that fascist get away with it. And it's an eternal blight on American foreign policy, the fact that we let this guy get away because, of course, he was a horrible, evil guy that colluded with Hitler and Mussolini to repress the brave partisans and Republicans fighting within Spain. Of course, that's the narrative, right? And then, of course, there's colonization. Of course, colonization was bad all the time, It's the one thing that explains why things are so bad in the countries that were previously colonized. And a perfect representation of this is Rhodesia, better known today as Zimbabwe, where you had a small white minority population that had essentially set up an apartheid state. 5% of the population brutally suppressed and denied the vote to millions of native Africans in order to protect their privileged little spot within the world until, thankfully, the world, and specifically the West, UK and the United States, launched embargoes and created conditions which were impossible for the oppressive Rhodesian government to stay in place. And that's when you had it liberated and becoming Zimbabwe. These are the of course narratives of the 20th century, or three of the of course narratives of the 20th century that are starting to be challenged by elements, not everybody, elements on the right. And so we're going to go through today and we're going to look at each one of these. And we're going to try to look at the various perspectives, the narratives that have been told us, and we're going to analyze. Is it a good idea to revisit some of this? And is anybody on the right actually making good points? Is Daryl Cooper making any good points? And with that, we're going to jump into the first question, and that was Churchill actually the chief villain of World War II? Not Hitler. Now, again, Daryl Cooper would be the first. Oh, I'm not saying Hitler's a good guy. I'm just saying that he's not the primary bad guy. Churchill is when you really dig into it. So what's the historical narrative? What's the historical perspective from the West on the concept of Winston Churchill?
I think this one's pretty straightforward, if you ask me. This is the center of what some people call the boomer truth regime. It's the moral, foundation of the last 80 years is World War II. It's portrayed as it's not portrayed as like a historical war. Mm-hmm. Every other war before it is portrayed as just an event in history. World War II is portrayed almost as this mythic theological struggle between good and evil, right? The Axis are evil and the Allies are good. And that's not to say that every single person, there's instances where, there's even in the official narrative, there's room for debate, right? Like Stalin is not usually considered a good guy unless you're a tanky, right? But the fact of the matter is that World War II is typically portrayed as an existential battle between good and evil. The Axis are evil. Hitler is worse than Satan himself. And so therefore FDR and Churchill are, modern saints. They're perfect in almost every single way.
Saved Western civilization.
And they saved Western civilization. And I feel like that's I don't actually really think I'm caricaturing the historical tape.
I think that's fairly accurate. That's what you get in your
high
school history.
What that does though is it's hard because these people who did stand up to Hitler, right, and did do these things, they also have failings, but we don't highlight those failings because they were so just like we don't highlight Hitler's art, okay? We don't highlight the negative things on the people who basically defeated Hitler, okay? So it's interesting because we sort of like look at these guys through rose-colored glasses and don't highlight any of the negatives.
You know what's interesting though? The left does criticize Hitler obviously they criticize Hitler. They criticize Churchill when it suits them for left-wing ends. So they will talk about colonization. They'll talk about India. They'll talk about, Churchill was also a racist. They use this. They use this to make a point, but it's the right that kind of uses Churchill. The kind of
let's do this. We talked about like what's the historical narrative is. Again, the left has kind of always criticized Churchill. The left has not always been on board with this idea.
But they will use him to a point.
Yeah, but they've criticized him as an imperialist, as a racist, and because Churchill was very, very anti-communist, they also didn't really like that aspect of it as well. But the general historical narrative, the general consensus was no, Winston Churchill was a very, very brave. He got it right when everybody else got it wrong about Hitler and who he was and why we needed to fight him and the whole deal. He saved England with the Battle of Britain and everything else. And so generally a good guy. The left was the only one that kind of questioned that for the most part. Now the right comes in. So what is the revisionist take? So the historical perspective is what we just kind of described. The revisionist take, I think, goes from a couple different ways. The left-wing view of Churchill is like, well, I don't care. Okay, the one good thing he did was stand up to Hitler, but he was an imperialist. He believed in preserving the British Empire. He he was a racist, and he was complicit in personally harming indigenous peoples, because he actually fought on what, 4 continents. Because he fought in India, he fought in the Boer War and the Sudanese War in Africa. He was a war correspondent in Cuba and saw action over there. And then he also fought in World War I. So in their view, he both has blood on his hands from that perspective, but he also they blame the famine in
Bengal
on him as well, and his response to it as leading to the deaths of millions. And so that's the left wing version of pointing out Churchill's flaws. The right-wing version of pointing out his flaws before was probably isolated to the Dardanelles and the Gallipoli campaign in World War I, where the British lost. I mean, thousands of people died in what ended up being a failed expedition, which all of his senior military advisors were telling him not to do. Churchill pushed forward with it. In fact, to understand Churchill pushed for that. It ended in failure. He actually resigned as First Lord of the Admiralty and then volunteered for the army and went to the trenches in World War I. I mean, he was so distraught about his decisions and stuff like that he decided to fight in his 5th conflict at that point. But the right-wing revisionist is, at least according to like a Daryl Cooper, is, well, no, the real reason why Churchill is a bad guy is not because of colonialism. It's not because of an empire. It's not because of, even the Dardanelles. It's because he actually, if you look at what Churchill was supposed to have protected, Western civilization, will look around. I think if you put it once, the right-wing revisionist history is he didn't save Western civilization. He defeated Hitler. But then that led to what? Well, it led to the Soviets taking over half of Europe and us being engaged in a Cold War. He also they
argue that he lost the British Empire.
Yeah, he lost the British Empire. That's another one of the arguments. Tucker Carlson, when in his interview with Piers Morgan, essentially suggested that, well, if he did such a good job of preserving it, look at the UK now. What did he preserve? What did he actually save? The other thing that like a Daryl Cooper will argue is Winston Churchill was a warmonger. Like all through the 30s. The historical narrative is Churchill saw something about Hitler that nobody else saw. The Daryl Cooper version of that is like, no, Winston Churchill pushed Hitler into doing things that he wouldn't have otherwise done.
I want to touch on that just very briefly. That is something that people like Cooper, I think, have really tried to bring up lately is this argument that, in a way that Churchill was so doggedly against any idea of peace or negotiation that he forced Germany into a position of, okay, well, then this is just an existential battle to the end then to see who conquers the other. Mm-hmm. And the argument being that Hitler tried to negotiate over Danzig, which is a German city that was separated after the Treaty of Versailles, that the area around it was controlled by Poland, but the city itself was some like quasi-independent state. And Hitler wanted it back because it was basically 100% ethnic German. And he also wanted like the Polish corridor, which used to be part of the German Empire. And the idea being that Churchill basically was against that because he was against appeasement. Mm-hmm. And so he forces Germany into this conflict where Hitler was not going to back off. But if Churchill's not going to negotiate, then you're just going to have a war. And then Germany turns its sights to Western Europe in May 1940 and rolls through
part of
the Low Countries in France and conquers them in 6 weeks.
Well, and keep in mind, Winston Churchill's not even prime minister yet.
No, he doesn't become prime minister until the day that Germany invades the West in May 1940. He replaces Neville Chamberlain. But in 6 weeks, the mighty French army, like we think of this today, it doesn't make sense. But back then it was a shock that the French were defeated so quickly. Yeah. Right? Now we think it's a meme, but the French get defeated really quickly in 6 weeks, and Germany occupies all of Western Europe, all the way up to Spain, which we'll get to in a little bit. And Germany tries to negotiate to a degree. Hitler gives some speeches suggesting maybe we should have peace. I'm willing to negotiate, and Churchill just denies every single one of them.
And it's also
that's Cooper's argument is that Churchill refuses to negotiate when it was clear at that point that the war had basically been lost. And he just forced an outcome that eventually wasn't good for obviously Germany, but he would argue was not good either for Britain either.
Or the West.
Or the West in general, because the idea being, well, we're going to war to defend the British Empire from Germany because Germany is an existential threat and we can't let them have all of continental Europe because the British Empire will be existentially threatened. And we're going to war to defend the integrity of Poland, which Germany invaded and conquered. And look at what happens after 1945. Poland is just a Soviet puppet state.
Yeah.
It's not independent. And the British Empire disintegrates within a generation after World War II. So bang up, I'm trying to not strawman, I'm trying to steelman this argument as much as I can.
Well,
the argument being like, bang up job, Churchill. Poland's now a communist dictatorship ruled by Stalin, and there is no British Empire anymore. And then within, a lifetime after this conflict, you now have millions of people pouring into the UK that don't want to be British, don't want to assimilate. They basically just want to take over this country. And you have native Brits in Britain that are accused of being racists on their own soil because they don't want mass migration.
Well, wait, real quick, I don't want to jump too far ahead because the other thing Cooper talks about, and this is where it makes it a little bit different, because there's been people that have kind of made these arguments before that Churchill wasn't able to actually say the things that he was trying to say. The other thing, too, though, is Daryl Cooper takes it a step farther, and I'm now starting to see, like, Candace Owens repeat this narrative where it's the firebombing of Dresden and the air campaigns against Germany, that Churchill was the one that was pushing for this, that, he knew that there was no legitimate military targets in any of these places, and all the men had either been shipped to the Eastern or Western fronts. So this was purely a terror campaign to try to drive Germany out of the war. Daryl Cooper then goes a step farther to suggest that a lot of, like, the mass execution of prisoners and civilians in the Eastern Front was not actually because the Nazis had a mission of extermination toward the Slavs, but really they didn't recognize they were, according to like Daryl Cooper, it's like, well, they were just, victims of their own success. The Russian army disintegrated so fast and they confiscated so much territory so fast and took so many prisoners that logistically speaking, they weren't in a position to be able to feed them. And so, from the Nazi perspective, it was, well, would it be more humane to just kill them all as opposed to letting them starve to death in camps or, whatever. So Daryl Cooper does go out of his way to kind of repeat some of the narratives that you actually saw from like Joseph Goebbels and others. Now, two things can be true at once. Can we reevaluate the firebombings of Dresden or whatnot and suggest that, well, this led to a tens of thousands of civilian deaths, and was that an appropriate response? Was that something that should have been done? The thing that I do think people need to, well, we're sticking on that, everybody. So that's the revisionist take, is that on the whole, Churchill could have had a negotiated peace with Hitler, but he was so adamant to go to war and so adamant to get the United States into war. And another thing Cooper's big on is Churchill was in the pocket of Jewish financiers, right? This is another part of the Cooper narrative. And all of those things combined, that's what drove him to not recognize that, or to push for war and then to conduct the war in a way that was inherently immoral and unnecessary. So now that we kind of understand the historical narrative, now that we kind of look at the revisionist narrative that's starting to pop up, among like maybe Tucker Carlson. And again, I don't want to associate things to Tucker or to Candace that they didn't say. So most of what I've talked about is Daryl Cooper. That he either said on Rogan's platform or on Tucker's platform. But I have heard Candace make similar comparisons with respect to the firebombing of Dresden and things of that nature as well. So that's the revisionist idea, right? So I have not heard, I've heard Tucker be critical of Churchill from the idea that he failed to protect any of the things that he wanted to protect. And I have not heard Candace Owens say that. I've never heard her say that Winston Churchill is the primary bad guy of World War II. So I don't want to attribute that to her, but that is kind of the Daryl Cooper narrative. So now that we've discussed that, the question is okay, so what's true? What's true to the best of our ability to kind of understand that? Well, okay, let's look at some of the criticisms right off the bat. So was Churchill a racist? I think you would be hard pressed to say that Churchill was somebody that just inherently believed that if you were a particular race, you were just an inferior human being. But I do think Churchill grew up, he was born in 1884, I think. He grew up at the kind of the Victorian era. And he grew up as part of the Churchill family, which has a long and robust and vaunted history within England. And not to mention that England was a country that, especially the Victorian time period and whatnot, they had this strong sense of aristocracy. Now, as Americans, we look at aristocracy as kind of like this evil, bad thing where you look down on people based off of maybe not just their race, but their economic standing or their bloodline, right? Like, who are you related to? Two things I think we have to understand without necessarily justifying some of the beliefs associated with aristocracy is that, one, this was in no way, shape, or form an unusual thing for people to believe throughout history. It was not an unusual thing for Europeans to believe. It was another person that believed in bloodline being a real strong indicator of whether or not you were worthy. Hitler, right? So the Nazis believed in this idea that was purely racial in a way that British aristocracy was not. But many of the Victorians kind of believed that for whatever reason, due to their ingenuity, due to having a privileged place before God, that they occupied this special place within history and humanity, and that obligated them to actually maintain and run society. That was the job of the aristocracy, is to use the privileged place they had within position to actually protect their country. And again, I'm using terminology that was used then to protect the lower orders. So they believed that there was society was inevitably, there was a status levels, inevitably. The British were more prone to allow people to move within those economic strata. But when it came to social strata, blood and family mattered. And that was just the way it was. He also grew up in a time where, of course, you had empires. Every major European country had one. To the extent that Germany didn't have one, it's because they lost most of it after World War I. But this idea that Winston Churchill would be strange to believe in aristocracy, or evil to believe in aristocracy, or evil to believe in imperialism or colonialism, it is a little bit absurd.
It's like saying that it's strange for Caesar to not believe in the glory of Rome. Mm-hmm. Like it's the water in which he swam in. Like that was the environment that he was born into and grew up in. Of course he was gonna.
But whereas Hitler believed that he had a special place to lead in society because he was head of the Aryans, and therefore, and he wrote this down. This is the other part where Daryl Cooper talks about, like, well, it's not that they meant to kill all these people with Eisotzen groups in Eastern Europe and Russia. They just didn't have enough food to care for all the prisoners. Bull crap. Like, really? Because Hitler would disagree with you, Daryl. Because he was pretty clear in Mein Kampf on how he broke down human civilization and who he thought were humans versus subhumans versus nothing to be used for slaves. And I got bad news for you, Daryl. The Slavs didn't rank very high on Hitler's view of how he wanted to, organize society. So Hitler used more of this Nietzschean will to power approach where so Churchill's like, I, as a part of the British aristocracy, have special privileges. Those privileges comes with responsibilities. That responsibility is the glory of the empire, but it was also to do things like in the institution of slavery, right? Like the British aristocracy wasted they spent a lot of blood and treasure doing what I believe is a very noble mission, which is trying to stop the international slave trade. And this builds right into this idea of this narrative of British aristocracy, which was rooted in this idea of privilege comes with responsibilities, not just more privileges. Hitler didn't see it that way. He goes, our job is
they thought that privilege comes with power, basically. And
yes. So this idea of understanding perhaps the things that West, especially the classical liberal West, which is very, very big on equality and representative government and all these other things, they would certainly critique what Churchill was doing. And there are things that Churchill did and said and believed that I would critique. But I at least try to critique him within the context of the times of which he was living and what he believed, not with this idea that because you believe this in 1912 about the British Empire, therefore you're an evil, horrible human being. I don't think that's accurate. What Hitler believed with respect to we have the will to power, we're going to rule, and we're going to treat these other people like they can simply be treated as slaves. They don't even have to be considered. They can be murdered and executed in mass to make way for the Aryans. That's inherently like that was evil at the time, right? I don't think you can compare these two things. And I think for Daryl Cooper to suggest that, some of the atrocities that the Nazis engaged in were simply a result of poor logistics, you have to either be so historically ignorant of what was going on or so biased in a particular way of thinking that you can honestly believe that, because the Nazis didn't say that. Goebbels and Hitler and none of these guys were saying, gosh, I wish we could save all these poor Russians and Poles. We just don't got anywhere to put them, or we just don't have the resources to feed. That is not what they were saying.
Actually, behind the scenes, they had entirely different plans. It was called General Plan Ost. And I'm sure that as soon as I say that, we're either going to get a mob of people coming in to argue about that. But like, General Plan Ost was basically the idea of what the Nazis were going to do with Eastern Europe after they win the war, which they didn't do, right? So it was only partially implemented. But it was this idea of like ethnic cleansing, genocide, wiping out the Russians, right? Wiping out the Poles, wiping out the Slavs, obviously wiping out the Jews, of course, as well. Yeah. But it wasn't, when we talk about like concepts like the Holocaust, it's important to remember that it wasn't one particular ethnic group that the Nazis wanted to exterminate. There were multiple ethnic groups that they wanted to wipe out. They wanted to wipe out Jews. They wanted to wipe out Russians. They wanted to wipe out all Slavs, Poles. There were elements within those groups that they were like, well, we're going to like kidnap their children and Aryanize them and Germanize. They did that with the Czechs, for example. They tried to Germanize the Czechs, which is actually, that's a very long tradition that goes back to the Holy Roman Empire. But like, you have the same thing in the Baltics, right? The Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians, they thought that they could Aryanize these people. But there were other groups of people that they just wanted to just wipe them out, basically, or totally enslave them. Like, there were very few Poles that the Nazis thought were worthy of living. Yeah. And that's very different than the British Empire's mindset, which was civilization building. And the left criticizes this as, oh, this is racist, the white man's burden. Yeah. Right. The old phrase, I think that's it goes back to the era of like Rudyard Kipling. Yeah. But the idea behind that, the left would argue, oh, this is super racist, the white man's burden. The idea behind it is that the British Empire is a force for spreading civilization around the world. And that as it goes forth and establishes colonies and protectorates, the idea is not to exterminate the native population. The idea is to lift up the native population to the same standard of being as London itself, as Manchester, as Liverpool, as anywhere in the United Kingdom. Mm-hmm. That is an entirely different worldview than the one that the Nazis espouse. So on that front, I don't think that the revisionist take has really much of a point. Where I do think that it has a point is when you look at the type of stated goals that Churchill and the Allies had at the onset of the war, it was not to stop General Plan Ost because it hadn't taken place yet. It hadn't even been like laid down yet. It wasn't to stop the Holocaust because it hadn't happened yet. That was, there was obviously persecution of Jews that had been taking place before the war, but there wasn't, the Holocaust kicked off after the war began, right? The Wannsee Conference was in 1942. And obviously there were still massacres before that, but the stated goals were to protect the integrity of Poland and to protect the British Empire. And on those two fronts, I don't think that there's any argument that those two goals were not achieved.
Well, I think the important thing to understand too, when you're talking about Poland and when you're talking about the empire, is that to properly understand where the British Empire was at the beginning of World War II, is World War I had gutted them. They had gone into massive debt. They had lost hundreds of thousands of dead. It was like an entire generation of British men had been wiped out in World War, not entire, but you know what I mean, in World War I. Maintaining overseas colonies was expensive. You had various political movements within the UK that were questioning the morality of
and the cost of it,
the morality and cost associated with the colonies. There's this left-wing narrative that empire was this huge boon to the country, the home countries that actually established empires, and there's certainly something to be said for benefits that happen with trade at various times and opening up various markets, but ultimately as time went on, especially into the late 18th and early 20th century, the empire was incredibly expensive for the British to maintain. So there was arguments that there was suffering at home as a result of trying to maintain this empire. Not to mention that you know, again, and if you look at the way the British did maintain the empire, and it varied a great deal based off of where they were at any given point and what was going on in various administrations that were put in place. And sometimes it was very brutal. And other times it was not. I mean,
other times it was almost non-existent.
Yeah. When you look at, like, for instance, India, there's no way that the British could have controlled India, if there had been a unified Indian opposition to the British Empire. There's just no way they could have managed that.
People are going to point out that they're sporadic, right? There was the Great Indian Revolt and the 1850s.
The British, by and large, worked by, through, and with the indigenous population.
They had princely states.
This is always the thing that never seems to be understood whenever we're talking about this. There's this idea, and I think a lot of Americans' minds, that what happened is the Spanish showed up to Mexico and killed all the Aztecs. The British showed up to India and enslaved all the Indians. It's like, there's no way that would have been possible. Like in most cases with empire, what you found was indigenous tribes that were more than happy to work. Indigenous tribes are indigenous people groups that were more than happy to work with the Europeans to their benefit at the expense of their other indigenous enemies. And so to think of India as like one happy unified country, no, that was just not the case. And again, that's not to take away with certain brutal repressions that took place or certain mismanagements which led to, you know, horrible humanitarian crises in India. But it's also not as simply explained with, you know, bad European shows up in order to impose.
But that's how the left presents
that's
it.
How the left
all these
portrays it.
White settlers came in and then they took all the land and took all the resources and enslaved everybody. And I
don't want to get too far ahead on colonialism. I think so. Here's what I would say. I think that you could definitely make an argument that the typical historical narrative, you know, maybe at least initially, didn't do enough to call into question certain decisions that the Allies made during World War II, or the implications for what some of those things meant. The problem is when you look at the context of what was actually going on, I look at Churchill's role and I see a guy that made mistakes throughout his life, but was actually pretty good at learning from them at various times. Yes, he wanted to protect the empire. That was not like, I love it when Tucker Carlson acts like that was all up to Churchill, as if Churchill had tried harder, they would have maintained the empire. Again, World War I devastated England. They were at a point where maintaining the empire was incredibly difficult to do, and not just because of you know, World War II then coming in after that and the costs associated with it. You had a massive political movement within the UK that didn't want to maintain the empire. So, okay, Tucker, what do you expect Churchill to do? Churchill made his arguments. Other people made their arguments. The British people voted. The empire eventually went away. So, like, I don't see that you can blame Churchill for that if you think that is something that is a dock on him. The other thing too is when it comes to England standing up to Hitler and to communism, we also need to understand that during World War I, when the British people were just like, everybody in Europe was done with war at the end of World War I. It was brutal. You know, you look at the Battle of the Somme, where within 3 days you had 64,000 casualties. Like, we can't even conceive of this anymore.
Oh, there were 60,000 casualties the first day.
Yeah, and then you have Churchill at that point being so anti-communist that he wanted, because this is another thing that, you know, Cooper and others are saying, is that, well, Churchill didn't do enough, you know, to fight the communists. Churchill wanted to actually send British troops to help the White Russians put down the Bolsheviks. Now, again, you can argue all day long, and would that have been a good choice? Would that have been a good use of resources? Fine, but you can't use it to claim that he's not sufficiently anti-communist.
He even floated the idea in 1945 of continuing the war against the Soviets this time, now that Germany had been defeated. Like, immediately after Germany's defeat in May, he floated this idea called Operation Unthinkable. Yeah. Because it was unthinkable.
Well, and the other thing too is keep in mind, when we look at was Churchill actually we can say a flawed person, because everybody is, but was he a heroic figure? Churchill, if you look at what Churchill was saying in the early, mid, and late 30s, Churchill was saying stuff. People forget Neville Chamberlain was not a Labour Party prime minister. Neville Chamberlain was a conservative. Churchill and Chamberlain were in the same party. Okay, so Churchill was saying things that were getting him kicked out of his own party at times. Like he was alienated because he was saying, look, Hitler is going to be a problem. This regime, what they believe, what they're trying to. He was saying this at the same time that he was saying, yeah, and the Bolsheviks are bad too. Churchill was calling out both fascism and communism at the same time, but he recognized that what was happening with Germany under Hitler was going to be a problem that was going to draw Europe into another war. And to suggest that all of the things that Churchill was saying caused what Hitler did, as opposed to accurately predicted what Hitler wanted to do, like takes a degree of cognitive dissonance that I can't even understand unless somebody has a bias that they're not actually revealing. Because there's no question that Hitler was expansionist. There's no question that Hitler wanted to take back certain territories so he could advance the Aryan race at the expense of others. Right? There's like no question of any of these things. There's no question. And yet we're being treated like, if Churchill just agreed to a very one-sided peace agreement with Hitler that essentially ceded Europe to Hitler, that everything would have been okay, and at least he would have fought the Russians, and maybe communism wouldn't have spread. It's like, you do realize that the name the Nazis stands for National Socialist German Workers' Party. Like, but please do not fall into this idea of believing that because the Nazis fought against the communists, that the Nazis were somehow, well, at least they were anti-communist. They were anti-communist in the sense that they were competing for a lot of the same voters, because both of them had socialist worldviews. The difference was where the communists believe in the international communist movement, the Germans believe in a nationalistic one. But they're both socialist on some elemental level. Maybe not both Marxist, but they're both socialist. And so I look at this, and I'm sorry, but I got no problem with us going back and looking at various things and asking important questions about what would have happened if the Western Front hadn't opened up first and it was just Stalin and Hitler going to war with one another. Would that have been better for the West if those two people would have exhausted themselves in a war and then the West could have come in afterward? Okay, maybe, but that didn't happen. And how do you stop that from happening? Nobody told Germany they had to invade the Low Countries and France first. They chose to do it, right? Like, so what was Churchill supposed to do? And keep in mind, and people are like, well, Churchill wanted to get the United States involved in the war. Of course he did. Of course he did. Churchill's looking at this going, this guy just wiped out France, which, by the way, France at that time was considered to have a bigger, more modern, and better military than the UK. Because the UK had always put more money into the Navy. Not that they ignored the Army, but they put more money into the Navy because that was key to basically maintaining the empire. So Churchill is now sitting here, is like, okay, Germany signed, like at this was before Hitler went back on the treaty he had signed with Stalin and invaded.
Yeah, it's late 1940. Churchill's
looking around going, we're it. Like, France has been knocked out. Italy's obviously sided with Germany. The Eastern European countries are either siding with Germany or
useless
or not going to bring any help, right? Russia and Germany have just carved up Eastern Europe. We're it. And you've got people within the British Parliament going, the math don't math. We've got to come up with some sort of agreement with Hitler. And Churchill gets up and says, no, we're never going to surrender our empire or our country to the Nazis.
But see, this is where the revisionist take comes in, because then they would say, no, instead you surrendered the empire to a bunch of Marxists in Africa, and you surrendered your home to a bunch of woke leftists at home.
But the question you got to ask the revisionist is like, oh, okay, because it would have been so much better if the Nazis were still in play.
This gets back to a
like
broader,
what a ridiculous.
This gets back to a broader point that Rudyard actually brought up in a video that he put out a couple years ago.
Yeah.
And Rudyard Lynch from What If Alt Hist, I think he's right on this, that society after World War II has tried actively to be as anti-Nazi as possible.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way that they also use the phrase anti-racist.
Yeah.
Like they looked at Nazi Germany and they tried to be the exact opposite of it. I've brought this up before. The Nazis were not woke.
Yeah.
You can argue that they were socialist economically, that they
totalitarian,
that,
atheists,
that they were no, I wouldn't say that they were atheists.
Okay, well
they were not
pagan.
Christians,
yeah.
but I definitely would not say that they're atheists like in the modern like Richard Dawkins sense.
No.
They had their own mythology and mythos and stuff like that, but no, like society has tried since the 40s to be the exact opposite of the Nazis because again the Nazis are portrayed as just the
personification of evil,
embodiment of evil. And that actually carries a lot of problems with it if you think about it, because the Nazis are, I mean, again, they're not woke. That's the one thing that they aren't. And that's where the revisionists are bringing up a point. And when they say that the West has become hyper woke and the Nazis were not woke, the Nazis emphasized masculinity. Very much so they emphasized masculinity. So what do? We demonize masculinity. We talk about toxic masculinity. We try to emasculate men. We feminize everything in society. Yeah. The Nazis were super racist, right? By the left's own definition. I mean, it's hard to find a more racist example than the Nazis using the left's own framework. So what do we emphasize? The absolute worst thing you can be as a human being is a racist. There's nothing worse, absolutely nothing worse that you can be, certainly in the eyes of the left, than to be a racist. The Nazis were extremely nationalistic, like, far beyond just patriotism. They were extremely nationalistic. So what are we going to promote in the West? The dissolving of nations altogether. The idea of a post-national concept of nationhood. In fact, we're going to demonize nationality. We're going to try to eliminate the concept of nationality, and we're just going to try to put everybody in
patriotism like it's dangerous.
We're going to treat everybody as just individuals. Everything is a hodgepodge, mixing of everything, dissolving of all national borders. Creation of multinational organizations like the EU, the UN, the IM, all of those things, right? And so I could just keep going down the list, right? That the Nazis were super hierarchical. They were, they really emphasized like order and unity and strength. And so what does the West do since the 40s? We're going to be super hyper egalitarian. I mean, even to a point of it being a parody of
the revisionist argument is the cost of beating the Nazis was to essentially allow not just Marxism, but a woke version of Marxism that never would have been possible otherwise. And that's kind of the direction that they're going. This is also why I say that there's a bias baked into this with Winston Churchill that I don't think they're ready to reveal, but is actually there. And I think what some of them, not all of them, not accusing Tucker of this, not accusing Candace of this, but I think some of them, I think the Fuentes side of the argument is essentially saying, well, say what you want about the Nazis, they would have never allowed drag queen story hour. And here's my problem with that. That's not to say I think drag queen story hour is horrible. But I refuse to accept that the only thing I'm allowed to choose is between, progressive woke neo-Marxism or Nazism. Those are not my only two options. And Winston Churchill, I think, fought for an option that bears a far closer resemblance to what I believe in, the idea that, well, no, what Western values reject both Nazism and Marxism, the sort of Western values he was fighting for. And so I think I think it's horribly inaccurate to try to say that Churchill was somehow the central evil character of World War II. I think the only way you get there is to reject the evidence in the Nazis' own words so thoroughly as to betray a pretty scary bias there. Because I've got no problem with people wanting to go back and relook at how things could have gone and how things could have been different, and fine. I have no problem with going back and looking. I do think it should be within the context of the times, and I'm sorry, but for me, Churchill, with all his flaws, deserves the pedestal he's been put on in the West as fighting against the two twin evils of the 20th century, Nazism and communism. And for those who are saying, well, the real problem is woke progressive, neo-Marxism. Okay. I agree that is also a huge problem, but Churchill fought against it. Well, he didn't do enough to prevent it. What should he have done different? That's one thing I never hear him say. What should he have done different? Darryl Cooper's solution is apparently he should have signed a peace treaty with the Nazis. Okay, Darryl, I'm sorry. Not going to agree with you on that. I think two things can be true at once. And that is both Nazism and communism have been the twin evils of the 20th century and the most destructive political and social ideologies, arguably in world history. So my conclusion, before we move on to the next one, my conclusion here is I think the element within the right that is trying to do the revisionist history of Churchill, I think there's certain things that they say about World War II that make sense with respect to what happened after the fact. But with respect to Churchill, I think they're just wrong. I don't.
I think that we're kind of the same mind there.
Yeah.
And there's a lesson to be learned about pure negation rather than trying to build something positive in terms of what you believe, what's your metaphysics. And we'll get to that at the end of it. But this leads us to another controversial point, doesn't it?
It leads us to the discussion about the Spanish Civil War, because this kind of reflects if the post-World War II consensus is fascism bad, well, then how could the Western countries allow for this fascist state in the version of Spain to exist? But before we get to that, if you're actually interested in making sure that your children are getting a version of history which is comprehensive, but also takes into account the various perspectives and contexts, but is also dedicated to a certain sense of objective truth and morality, the belief that there is such a thing as right and wrong, and there is a way that we can arrive at certain conclusions about what happened historically, well, then you might be a little bit frustrated with what is going on within our public school systems these days. That is why Tina and I came together and we did a 12-video series sharing on why we chose to homeschool. And spoiler alert, there was a lot of different reasons, but it wasn't our original plan. And perhaps the most important reason that we chose to homeschool, we actually reveal in this video. And it's probably not what you think, because we were also very, very frustrated with what was being taught in our schools and what we saw on the horizon. And I was in a unique position to see some of these things transpiring within the public school system. But it wasn't the problems with the public school system that were our chief motivation for continuing to do it, even when it got really hard. So if you want to learn more about why we chose to do it, why we stuck with it, with all three of our kids having gone through essentially kindergarten to graduating high school and now moving on, and we have a great relationship with the kids. We love them. They love Jesus. They don't like Karl Marx, and they are responsible human beings. If you'd like to learn more about why we did this and some of the rumors that we debunk about homeschooling, go check out the link in the description right now. So you can go to link in the description, click on that. You can sign up. This 12 video series is free. They're relatively short videos as we guide through some of the top things that we took into consideration. But a big part of it was wanting to make sure that we could equip our children to understand what they believed, understand what mom and dad believed, but also challenge them to be able to understand different ideas, concepts, and perspectives, and to do so through a lens that respected the idea of objective truth, objective morality, and hopefully prepare them to be able to go out into the world. And so far, we're pretty happy with our results. Go check out that link in the description. Sign up for that. All right. Spanish Civil War. Okay. Now, a lot of people, World War II is obvious, right? Everyone knows about World War II. Pretty much everyone has heard of Winston Churchill and Hitler and everyone else, right? So when we talk about these things, everyone's kind of on the same sheet of music with the historical narrative, and then talking about the revisionist narrative and whether or not it's true. Is something that we get into a little bit more. When it comes to the Spanish Civil War, not so clear. So let me go ahead and give you the historical narrative, the popular historical narrative in the West for the Spanish Civil War. We've actually got a map up on the screen right now that you can take a look at that kind of shows you how Spain was carved up as this war was taking place and which areas controlled what. But essentially, I would say that the popular historical narrative is that Franco was a fascist that overthrew the legitimate elected Republican government of Spain. He then took help from Hitler and Mussolini in order to violently suppress his opposition, which was known as in certain elements as the White Terror, where he systematically issued orders resulting in the summary execution, torture, death between 100 and 200,000 Spaniards. And that it is kind of to our eternal shame that we did not offer more assistance to the Republican faction, is what they're known as, fighting Franco and his Spanish fascists. In fact, there was even a group of Americans that went over and fought in Spain known as the Lincoln Brigade, and that among those people that fought against Franco was none other than Ernest Hemingway. And so when you think about there was actually I think it was called there was a movie that was made for, I think it was called For Whom the Bell Tolls. Don't quote me on that. We'll check that real quick. I think that's what it was made. But it was basically a kind of a positive rendition of, again, the Republican forces, the partisan forces fighting against evil Franco. And the only reason why Franco was allowed to kind of remain in power at the same time that the West was vanquishing fascists in Germany and Italy was because Franco was anti-communist. And so as bad as Franco was, the West kind of made this deal with the devil and allowed Franco to remain in place, provided that he was still violently suppressing the communists within Spain, because that became the chief concern post-World War II, was preventing the expansion of communism and Soviet influence over other countries. And obviously Spain was of unique concern to the United States because and the Western powers, because when you look at NATO, it wouldn't have been a good idea to have a communist Spain or a pro-communist Spain due to its geographical locations and the implications that would have meant for the NATO alliance. Is that a fairly good, popular
Yeah, I mean,
version?
the idea that Franco's the fascist dictator, bad guy in Spain, he's
Yeah.
the Spanish Hitler or Mussolini, and the Republicans were liberal Democrats; they were the good guys.
Yeah, they believe in
And-
representative government. Well, and to give you an idea too, what had happened is you had kind of the Second Republic that came into play here.
In the early
What is it?
1930s.
Yeah, early 1930s. I'll just read this off real quick. April 1931, Second Spanish Republic established. King Alfonso XIII flees after municipal elections show strong Republican support. The Republic introduces reforms, including land redistribution and secularization, sparking opposition from monarchists, landowners, and the Catholic Church. But in October 1933, a right-wing coalition, including CETA, the Spanish Confederation of Autonomous Right-Wing Groups, wins general elections. Reforms of the Republic are stalled or reversed, increasing tensions with left-wing groups. In October of 1934, the Asturias Miners' Revolt, left-wing workers and miners in Asturias, stage an uprising against the right-wing government. The revolt is brutally suppressed by General Francisco Franco, killing over 1,000 and deepening political divisions. February 1936, Popular Front, a coalition of left-wing parties, socialists, communists, anarchists, and Republicans, wins general elections. Land and labor reforms resume, provoking backlash from conservatives, monarchists, and the military. July 12th, 13th, 1936, assassination of Jose Calvo Sotelo, a prominent monarchist leader, by Republican police in retaliation for the murder of a leftist officer. This act serves as a catalyst for military uprising. That's kind of like the events leading up to when does it go from the political parties, engaging in acts of violence, but still working through kind of the political process to that's it, all out civil war. So that gives you kind of
And it was just days after that assassination that the military staged
Revolted.
a coup that was halfway successful.
Yeah.
And that's the reason that the Civil War took place, because they I've got the map up here. They took
Yeah.
North Africa, they took Spanish Morocco.
Yeah, if you look at the map, to give everyone kind of an idea, because there's a lot of colors on here, think of the generally red areas as the Republican or left-leaning. We say Republican, and in America we have this idea of like, oh, Republicans, you mean like conservatives? No.
No.
The Republicans in this sense were left-wing, and
To put it mildly,
well, they
left-wing.
were predominantly communist and anarchists, but
and socialist.
and socialist. But then you also had an element there of
They were also progressives too.
yeah, but you also had an element there of the communists that had sworn allegiance to Stalin, because again, it's important to understand that that communism, the way Marx envisioned it, and the way that the Soviet Union was simply trying to manage it, was an international entity, right? It was the International Communist Revolution. And so you had communists in Spain that saw Spain, they had an objective that Spain would one day be a Soviet socialist republic as part of, the overall Soviet project. That's not to say that all communists believe that in Spain. That certainly wasn't the case. Certainly the anarchists didn't necessarily subscribe to that. But this is kind of the breakdown. And it wasn't Franco that actually kind of was seen as the leader of the rebellion or the coup. Initially, it was a Malo.
Yeah, there were a few nationalist leaders, but a lot of them got killed right at the start of the conflict, and so Franco kind of found himself in a position where he was.
Well, Franco was also commanding troops in Morocco, which were considered kind of the cream of the Spanish military, because they had been fighting. They had the most recent military experience. Because remember, when Franco kind of essentially assumes power, Hitler's kind of anticipating that, oh, well, we gave you aircraft, we gave you tanks, we gave you everything. You're going to join the Axis powers. And Franco took a position of strict neutrality in World War II.
He did not take a position of strict neutrality. He did allow German U-boats occasionally to supply themselves operating in the Mediterranean.
But he didn't join the
He did not join the
Axis,
Axis, even though the Axis they negotiated really hard to get Spain into the war like Italy, but Franco ultimately decided to stay neutral, which saved him.
Franco was also in a position where he couldn't have prevented German U-boats from operating anyways.
Well, I mean, if Germany had wanted to invade them, they could have.
Yes. Franco was in no position to basically prevent Germany from doing what they wanted to do, especially from a naval position, because initially when the Civil War broke out, it was the left-wing faction that had control of the Navy. Now, what they had also done is purged the military and
all
the Navy.
All the conservative officers.
And so they didn't really, they weren't even able to really prevent the transfer of Moroccan troops over to the mainland.
But to get back to the whole historical versus revisionist take. Yeah, historical take is he's a fascist dictator who overthrew the republic, established a fascist dictatorship that lasted until he died in 1975. Mm-hmm. And he's a bad guy who was in league with Hitler and Mussolini, but he didn't go all the way and support them in World War II in the form of joining the war outright. The revisionist take is very different.
Yeah.
The revisionist take is that Franco saved Spain from a Marxist takeover. And that he established a dictatorship, but he established a very different type of dictatorship than a Stalinist one that would have taken place in Spain if he had lost, if the nationalists had been defeated.
Well, and the other part of the revisionist side of this is that if you, again, Hollywood and everyone likes to talk about the white terror, they don't like to talk about the red terror,
which killed just as many people and was just as brutal.
Historians will. So again, the popular historical narrative on this, and this is also subject to kind of
they're going to argue that it killed more than
they're going to argue that he killed more and it was more systemic, which is to say that Franco organized, approved it, and it was top down. And their argument is that a lot of the features of the Red Terror were bottom up, right? It wasn't part of it wasn't. I have a hard time believing that, but let's talk a little bit about the Red Terror, because this is part of the, I wouldn't say revisionist, it's acknowledged that this took place, but the revisionists are looking at this going, wait a second, this Franco guy doesn't sound as bad as he was made out in my history book. So you had the anti-clerical violence and massacres of clergy. Republicans, particularly anarchists and some communist factions, targeted Catholic clergy and religious institutions, viewing them as symbols of conservative oppression. Churches, monasteries, and convents were burned and clergy were executed en masse. Approximately 6,800 to 7,000 priests, monks, and nuns were killed, primarily in the war's early months in 1936. In Catalonia alone, which, by the way, you ask a Marxist, where has communism ever worked? They always like to talk about a couple years in Catalonia. Thousands of clergy were murdered, with 58 churches and monasteries burned in Barcelona. Nuns were reportedly subjected to torture and sexual violence in some cases. You also had the Paracuelos massacre in 1936. An estimated 2,000 to 4,000 people, including civilians, military officers, and clergy, were executed near Paracuelos. I'm probably saying this wrong. Sorry. De Arma, and dumped in mass graves. Purge of anti-Stalinist Republicans. This was an interesting one. Stalinist communists, backed by the Soviet NKVD. This is, again, that's always left out, right? They talk about Hitler and Mussolini supporting Franco. They never talk about Stalin supporting the Republicans. Stalinist communists backed by the Soviet NKVD agents targeted rival leftist factions, particularly the anti-Stalinist POUM, or Workers' Party of Marxist Unification, and anarchists, accusing them of disloyalty or Trotskyism. So there was purges there. Executions in Republican-controlled areas. In areas under Republican control, councils and tribunals controlled by communists, anarchists, and other groups executed suspected nationalist conservatives or those deemed enemies of the people. In Rwanda, Andalusia, 512 suspected nationalists were executed in the war's first month. Similar killings occurred in other Republican strongholds, often fueled by mob violence or summary trials. Estimates suggest tens of thousands were executed across Republican zones, with figures varying widely. Some claim up to 100,000. Other recent estimates suggest 50 to 70,000. So it's important to understand.
This is part of the reason the Republicans lost the war, because they were too busy purging and killing themselves.
Yeah.
While the nationalists were unified around Franco.
Yeah, and again, it's important to understand that this was an anti-monarchist, and it was anti-monarchist, and it's important to understand too. It's not as if the Spanish monarchy. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Christian, but at this point in time, it's not like the Spanish monarchy was operating as an absolute monarchy.
No.
There was still local elections. There was representative.
It was hardly
government.
functioning at all.
Yeah.
That's why Alphonse, abdicated after his side lost those municipal elections in 1931, and then he fled the country.
Well, and part of the reason the fleeing, because there was a big pushback against, again, anything that was considered part of the old order, because these were not Republicans in the sense that they just wanted Republican.
They wanted the new Soviet man is what they really wanted.
They were largely socialist. This was a socialist revolution that had taken place first electorally. But then here's the other thing too, is that, and Christian, this one I think you know more about than I do. There's this idea that, okay, the socialist won, and they started to do all these like massive left-wing reforms, and so there was a reaction to that, especially because they were quite brutal to the church. Now you can also argue that the church in certain areas didn't have the best reputation for things that the Catholic Church had done in Spain, but there's no question that they carried it out, like the zeal with which they were persecuting members of the clergy was horrendous. I mean, this is not, hey, we just don't want the church to own a bunch of state property and we don't want to have to tithe to the Catholic. That's not exclusively what this was. But when they regained power in 1936, was it 36?
It was the 36 election.
36 election when they regained power. It's not as if they went in there and said, okay, well, hey, we won one election, you guys won the last one, but we won this one. And they attempted to make drastic alterations outside of the normal political order. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong.
Oh, no, they tried to remake all of society. Mm-hmm. This was something that the rightists were warning in the lead up to the 1936 election. They were like, this country's going to disintegrate if the Popular Front, they call themselves that as usual, right? Yeah. If they win this election, by the time, let's put it like this. By the time the military coup took place in July 1936, that was only halfway successful, there were huge swaths of the Spanish population that welcomed the coup.
Yeah.
Like, again, this is the pushback against the historical narrative. There's this idea that the military, which was staged by a bunch of fascists, overthrew this democratically elected Republican government, and they established a fascist dictatorship that lasted until 1975. No, they did not. Mm-hmm. First off, Franco was not a fascist, which we'll get to in a second. Yeah. But second off, the idea that, the Spanish people were oppressed by this regime. Half the Spanish public heard the news of the coup and welcomed it.
Yeah.
There were thousands of civilians in the more conservative parts of Spain. Like, there's these stories of rural villages in the northern part of Spain, up here in the north central part, that when they heard about the coup, they had festivals celebrating the fact that the military were trying to restore order, because the conservative elements of society genuinely believed that a Marxist revolution was unfolding right before the coup had taken place. Between February, when the elections had taken place, and July, when the coup took place, they thought that there was a literal Marxist revolution like what had taken place in Russia that was unfolding. And so people were stockpiling weapons. Mm-hmm. They were hiding. They were shutting down their businesses. Conservatives were being murdered in the streets in the countryside. The government was forcibly confiscating people's property without any compensation. They were closing down churches. They were shooting clergy. They were burning them. They were looting them. And if you were not a Marxist, if you were not a socialist or a progressive, you were utterly terrified of your own government. You were begging somebody to do something. There's this set of speeches. In fact, actually, I had a I'm not going to bring it up, but I wrote a Twitter thread on this several months ago, and there's a quote from that thread, and CETA, the Conservative Party, had their head of their party gave some speeches to the the Spanish Cortes, their parliament, just days before the assassination of Jose Sotelo. Or sorry, a couple days after it, but before the coup, like the last meeting of the Spanish Parliament before the coup and the Civil War kicked off. And he, in fact, actually, I've got the thread now. I'm going to read the end of it. It was Jose Gil Robles, and I'm going to butcher his name, but he warned on July 15th, 1936. He read off calls, endless calls. He had like 2 dozen newspapers on his desk, and they were all leftist newspapers, like socialist newspapers in Barcelona and Catalonia and Madrid. Yeah. And he was reading all the headlines off, and they were calling for the extermination of anybody on the right, of Catholics, of business owners, of capitalists, of anybody that was a conservative.
This isn't a Reddit blogger, right? These are the major newspapers.
They were calling for the literal extermination of conservatives in Spain. And he read them off, and then he warned, and he said, quote, "The day will come when the violence you have unleashed will be turned against you." Mm-hmm. And it was literally just a couple days after that the military staged that coup. And he was totally right, of course. And what is left out of this story is that half of the Spanish public welcomed Franco as a liberator, not as a dictator, as a champion of Spain and of Catholicism and of the traditional old order that the Marxists had tried to destroy through violent force, not through convincing arguments, and not even through winning elections. They rigged the 1936 elections. That's another thing that's left out of this story. The Republican government, the left-wing government that the military tried to depose in July 1936, they stole that election. That election was absolutely fraudulent. And there's been multiple studies that have been done on this to demonstrate that it was a fraudulently held election. The other thing, too, is that what's left out is that the idea of the republic itself was not viewed as a neutral institution the way that the American Republic was set up as. Yeah. That this is a unique form of government that anybody can participate in. The progressives, the Marxists, the socialists, the left-wingers in general, they viewed the republic as their personal pet project that they had a monopoly over, and that they had no reason to grant legitimacy to any movement that wasn't their own to obtain political power. So when CETA was formed to try to actually contest the electoral sphere and represent the wishes of the conservative populace in Spain, and then they won the next set of elections after the republic was declared, the left did not view that as a legitimate victory. The left staged a communist uprising in Asturias after they lost the elections, because they viewed the republic not as, again, a neutral institution. They viewed the republic as an ideological project that they had a monopoly over, and that conservatives had no moral right to have political control over the system.
That's an important part to remember, because whenever you look at communist regimes, they're always one-party states, right? They might not start off that way, but that's like, I think you mentioned something that's very important. When they talked about the republic, they didn't mean the republic as, hey, we're all a part of this republic and now we're all going to participate. No. This is, you're the bad guys, you're evil, you're the ones we overthrow. You don't get to participate. The fact that you get votes is offensive to them. Now, you can get them as long as you don't win anything. But the moment you win, or the moment you can stop our agenda, we're now morally justified to oppose the election results and to engage in violent uprisings in order to achieve our aims. Because again, we own this concept of the republic is something that they owned as a political party. Now, here's what I want to get to, and this is we've already kind of talked about, how the historical narrative says it, how the revisionists are talking about. Now let's get to, okay, what's true. I'll give you my take on this one. I can't bring myself, when I read about this, I cannot bring myself to look at Franco the way I would like a Churchill or anything like that, right? I think Franco perpetrated and allowed atrocities to take place under the White Terror that are just horrendous. the problem is I go back to this idea like, okay, but what was the alternative? Well, the alternative was communist leaders that were pushing something that was horrendous. And like you said, I think pushing Franco is just a full-blown fascist. Yes, the fascist party allied with the nationalists. There's no question. Yes, he sought help from Hitler and Mussolini because they were willing to give him munitions. They were willing to give him, airplanes and tanks, and he needed it to be able to fight because Stalin was giving airplanes and tanks to. And so the part with the revisionists that I am sympathetic to is this idea that, again, you're going to tell me that Stalin supporting the communists over there and then engaging in a purge of communists that weren't loyal to Stalin. You don't see that as a problem? You're going to elevate that up as, oh gosh, wow, the Lincoln Brigade and these guys were the guys that just wanted representative government. No, they weren't. There was a Soviet-backed communist revolution taking place in Spain, and it spurred off a civil war with people that didn't want nuns and priests executed in the streets. So I'm not going to hold up Franco as some sort of hero. But the truth of the matter is when I look at the Spanish Civil War, I get very, very concerned. And the reason why is because when you get to a point within a society where one side that does want Marxist revolution is willing to use power in order to denegate, destroy, kill, murder, confiscate, and they believe they have the moral authority to do so, there comes a point where this is no longer a question of elections anymore. This is just a question of fighting. And if you're fighting for what you believe is your survival, if you're fighting for the existence of your country as you recognize it, and Franco was he saw himself as being a loyal Spaniard and a loyal Catholic. Well, then what you see is both sides treating the others as if you're not human anymore. You are my existential enemy, and anything I can do to destroy you is now morally justified as a result. Now, there's something inherently immoral about that mindset. And I do believe that it took hold of large portions of both sides of the Spanish Civil War. But I am no longer willing to accept that this is something where, the Franco side of this is just exclude. They're the only evil bad guys, and everyone else was good and just fighting for representative government. That is verifiably false. You saw you saw a very big breakdown of any sort of objective morality beyond my side must win and your side must lose. And you ended up seeing the dehumanization of both sides as a result. So that when I look at that, when I assess the Spanish Civil War, now here's what I will say, and this is the part that'll get you in trouble. If you are forced into a binary of who should have won, it's Franco. I don't want to be forced into that binary.
There were a lot of people that made that same decision.
I don't want to be. I don't want that to be my only choice. But would I have preferred a Marxist revolution, a violent Marxist revolution in Spain that was butchering nuns and priests? No.
J.R.R. Tolkien said the same thing. He was alive during the Civil War, and he supported Franco. Not because, when I say supportive, again, you know what I mean? It's not, that's not to say that he supported everything that Franco did, but he absolutely viewed Franco as the lesser of two evils in that conflict.
And I think that's a good way to put it. It's like, you cannot look at what happened during the White Terror and various Spanish soldiers that were, literally SAing, we got to be careful on what words we use, SAing Spanish women and holding up, their undergarments on their bayonets. I can't I'm not rooting for that side. Right. But that's the problem that we find ourselves in, is that this is the part where you have a conflict that denigrates into that kind of atrocities being leveled against one another. I mean, I don't think I would have loved it if the guy who was desperately appealing to the conservatives and trying to convince the leftists that this is going to be unleashed on you if you continue to do it. I would have loved it if he would have convinced the left to recognize what was going to be coming if they continue to pursue the course of action that they did. He didn't. He lost that argument. And then you're forced into this question of what do you do?
What happened in Spain is it is probably the clearest example that I can think of what occurs when the dehumanization and application of the friend-enemy distinction becomes absolute, basically.
Yeah.
And I mean, these were two people two groups of people who shared a country but did not view each other as Spaniards.
Yeah.
It arguably did not even view each other as human. Like the reason that, the Spanish Civil War is truly one of the, in terms of numbers, it's obviously not the deadliest civil war in history, but in terms of brutality and intensity, it's got to be like top 5, maybe even top 3. Because to me, what it is again, one of the clearest cut examples of two groups of people that stopped viewing each other as fellow citizens of a shared country and started viewing each other as, you are an existential evil that must be purged out of my country if my country is to live. Mm-hmm. And then you look and see the brutality that took place throughout the war, and it's understandable why it happened. When I say it's understandable why it happened, again, that does not mean that it is morally acceptable.
Yeah.
I'm simply saying it's the logical consequence of taking things to that point. Yeah. And again, I would like to point out, the left created this problem. Before the coup, or actually before the Asturias Uprising in 1934, there was a divide within the right over what to do, because huge chunks of the right were monarchists in Spain. And there was one side that was like, no, no compromise. We want to bring back the king. We want to uproot this, root and stem. This is all satanic. We need to just get rid of all of this. And then there was a more moderate side of the right that was like, no, we'll fight it out electorally. We'll campaign for our policies. We'll get elected, and we'll fix this stuff democratically through the electoral process that the Spanish Republic has set up. And that we'll play within the rules of the system. Mm. And they won. They won that election. And the left literally tried to stage a revolution in Asturias in response to that immediately afterwards. Mm-hmm. The reaction on the right to that is what told them, oh, no, these people on the left will never consent to them losing anything, even if it's through the peaceful democratic electoral process. Yeah. They don't grant us moral legitimacy to exist, let alone to exercise power. And at that point, the revisionist take, even within then, of course was going to win out, because the side that wanted to operate within the rules had been disproven. They had been proven wrong. Mm-hmm. And so what else can you do other than just surrender to the left? You at that point, it was from that moment onwards that the right stopped trying to operate within the rule of law and started plotting to overthrow the republic, and they gave up on it. Yeah. And I don't blame them for giving up on it.
And my whole take on the again, the right-wing revision of the Spanish Civil War is I can't I find it very, very difficult to root for a side on this. I'll put it that way, because of the way that operations were conducted. But I have come to the conclusion that it was under the circumstances that existed, and that being the only choice you get to choose from history is what happened versus what didn't, not what you would have liked. Spain would not have been better. Spain would not have been better had the Marxists won that war. Period. The end. And I would have, so it's like, I'm not sitting here saying, oh yeah, Franco, great guy. Like, that's not my position at all. I'm saying that I think what he was fighting was arguably worse. And that's my take on it. I don't know if you got a different one than that.
No, I mean, maybe I have a little bit more favorable view of Franco. My biggest issue with Franco, I got to be careful about how I phrase this, because I don't want people to I'll just say it. Yeah. I think that Franco didn't go far enough. I don't mean that insofar as there's the loaded word.
This is where people are saying, "Oh, you wanted more atrocities."
Now, so I said that to catch your attention.
Yeah.
I don't mean that in the sense that, oh, he should have done the white terror more. What I meant is that I don't think he was traditionalist enough, in the sense that he set up a military dictatorship.
Yeah.
That kind of lacked legitimacy outside of the context of he was on the winning side. But other than that, it was just a strong man military dictatorship. And at the end of his life, he did put in the work to restore the monarchy, but I would argue he put in the wrong monarch. Like, look at what happened after he died, right? The monarchy then democratized Spain, but it went right back to being run by socialists and cultural Marxists rather than historical Marxists. And so that's what I mean by he didn't go far enough. I don't mean he didn't go far enough in like perpetrating atrocities. I meant in terms of his political regime, his political program. Well, I don't think that he did enough to lay the foundations for a successful Spain that would succeed him. Yeah. Because I look at Spain today, and Spain's run by literally, it's run by socialists today.
Here's my concern. Why is this important? Why is this important for us to understand? The direction I see the argument going in certain places with certain subsets of the right, I see it going in that Spanish Civil War direction, where it's the dehumanization of one's opponents and it's the win at all costs. And here's the problem with fighting existential fights. When you're fighting existential ones where it's like, if I lose, I'm dead. Those get very, very brutal, and moral lines get blurred very, very quickly. When there's that degree of there's a reason why they talk about civil wars being some of the most brutal, is because you don't see your opponent as merely an enemy. You see them as a traitor. And we have a special animosity for traitors that we don't actually convey to armed combatants in a different war.
If you capture an armed combatant, usually you should, well, not even usually, you should, but unfortunately this only sometimes happens. You treat them as a prisoner of war. When you capture a traitor, you shoot them. Traitors typically get capital punishment, whereas captured enemy combatants in a war, unless you're the bad guy, right? Yeah. You typically don't shoot them. You take them as prisoners of war, and you're kind of under a moral obligation to treat them in a certain way until the end of the war, when you can repatriate them back to their home country. That's typically how wars should be fought. Unfortunately, the 20th century has demonstrated a breakdown in that. But
I think you look at most wars throughout history, that's more the norm than not. But there is generally speaking, again, I can say this as someone that fought. When I fought overseas, obviously I was fighting terrorist organizations that I absolutely despised. But there was other people that get caught up in that fight that were not hardcore terrorists, but they were fighting because they got paid, right? Or they were fighting because, they were in a situation where they were intimidated, and if they didn't side with the right side, well, they would get in trouble, and they didn't see the Americans as the right side. I didn't have that same sort of animosity for someone like that. But again, we view enemy combatants. A lot of times you can view someone else. Like you saw this with respect to World War I, where the Germans and the British are fighting. And then on Christmas, they get out there and they have a soccer game in no man's land, because there's this degree of humanization that, hey, those of us who are in the trenches are not the ones that asked for this war, right? We were sent to go fight a war, and you may be my enemy, and I'm going to try to kill you, and you're going to try to kill me, but I don't hate you as a human being. We typically don't feel the same way about traitors. And that's where I think studying and understanding the Spanish Civil War and how quickly things can break down to where your own side, even the side that you may think should win, can be capable of horrible, horrible things if you're not very, very careful. And this leads us to our last question. This is the question of Rhodesia or Zimbabwe. And so we've got a map up here of Rhodesia or again, present day Zimbabwe. If you kind of look down at the lower map in the left-hand corner, maybe my head's in the way, I don't know. But we're talking about a country that is just north of modern-day South Africa. This, again, the historical narrative, which I already kind of talked about, but I'll do it again right here. Rhodesia was a white supremacist apartheid state that needed to be decolonized. The rest of sub-Saharan Africa, the rest of Africa in general, but largely sub-Saharan Africa, was decolonizing at that particular point. One of the conditions for the British allowing colonies to essentially leave the British Empire was to allow for
majority
rule. That was the word. So you saw a couple of countries in sub-Saharan Africa. You had the Portuguese Empire, you had the British Empire. The British were decolonizing. The Portuguese fought at first and were actually able to keep their colonies until they had a revolution within Portugal, and that led to a left-wing revolution, and they started decolonizing as well. But Rhodesia was this really, really interesting kind of case study, So Rhodesia is named after Cecil Rhodes, who was considered kind of like the arch imperialist of sub-Saharan Africa. He had a dream to build a railroad that went from Cairo all the way down to Cape Town. So basically stretching the entire length of the African continent. And so if you look at British colonial interests within Africa, you will notice that they kind of line up where the railroad was being built. And, there was a variety of reasons on why they wanted to accomplish this. They would argue that some of them were humanitarian. Some of them were just, you could say for profit or for trade, to facilitate trade. But Rhodesia, without getting too deep into the history, Rhodesia was essentially settled by white people. They encouraged white settlement of Rhodesia because it was largely unpopulated. You had some of the tribes that were initially there were kind of pushed out by other tribes to include, offshoots from the Zulus and whatnot. And so the idea was this was a critical part for the railroad because you needed it for the railroad. It was also considered kind of like it was very, very good for agricultural purposes. There was also mining interests. And so the whole idea was Cecil Rhodes kind of encouraged white settlement of this area. In fact, Cecil Rhodes is buried in Zimbabwe. And that was the purpose, is we were going to create this colony. And it went through several phases. You had South Rhodesia. You had a kind of a confederation of various colonies that were all, somewhat unified. Rhodesia had been largely self-governing for a long time, so it was still a part of the British Empire, still subservient to the British Empire, but largely self-governing. And they had set in certain processes. Now, some of these processes were considered to be very, very, again, the historical narrative is the whites came in, took up all the best farmland, relegated the black population to the more arid portions of the country, set up political, economic, and social systems which gave advantages to the whites at the expense of the native black population, even though at the height of the white population in Rhodesia, it never really surpassed. I think it was around 350,000. Don't quote, that could be different, but it was 350,000. So it made up roughly about 5% of the overall population. And yet it controlled the majority of seats within the Rhodesian parliament. It controlled the prime ministership. And so the idea is that as the British were pulling out in the 60s and 70s out of Africa, you saw other British colonies breaking away. So you saw, what was it? The ones that Zambia and Malawi. So Zambia and Malawi had previously been in kind of this colonial confederation. And then as they gained independence under the idea that it would be majority rule. Well, obviously in all of these places, majority rule meant that the black voters within the country, if it was one person, one vote, they would have the majorities. And so they would instantly take over all of the parliaments and the political structures within that country. Rhodesia had wanted to maintain the same structure it had as a colony. And so Rhodesia had a unique setup. I'm sorry, I keep going like they had a setup that said that it wasn't apartheid. It wasn't strictly apartheid. It didn't say whites and blacks. It said,
and this goes against the traditional historical narrative.
It does. The historical narrative was it was apartheid. The historical narrative says that, okay, even if you didn't set it up as blacks and whites, like South Africa was, where like blacks were restricted, you set it up in a way with financial and educational requirements that the black population couldn't meet, didn't have a hope of meet. And so even if it wasn't strictly apartheid, it was in effect apartheid. And so the idea was whereas every other sub-Saharan country, with the exception of South Africa and an apartheid state, was decolonizing and giving the country back to the native Africans, Rhodesia fought in order to maintain. Britain would not let them gain independence under their current setup. They insisted that they accept majority rule. Ian Smith, the prime minister of Rhodesia, decided he wanted, this is the historical narrative, wanted to keep his apartheid state. So he declared independence from Great Britain, which was actually the only other colony to do so apart from the 13 colonies which became the United States. And again, in order to maintain control, this led to the Bush Wars. You had various political parties led by various entities. The most popular one became the one run by Mugabe, and those parties were once again backed by the Soviets. But the popular historical narrative is a bunch of white colonialists and settlers and colonialists and imperialists kept on to a rigid political system that benefited them at the expense of the majority population. for the purpose specifically of oppressing them and keeping their privileged place within society. And so therefore the proper thing to do was for the West to alienate, isolate, not recognize the independence or sovereignty of Rhodesia as a nation, and to eventually allow the native population to overthrow them, gain majority rule. And again, so what happened was the appropriate thing. That's the general historical narrative. The revisionist take was, okay, Rhodesia has actually, again, Rhodesia had operated under a certain colonial setup. They wanted to maintain that colonial setup. Prime Minister Ian Smith warned that if you went to straight majority rule, that Marxist militias would essentially take over the country. There, you would chase all the white people out through the confiscation of lands and through retributions. And that Zimbabwe would essentially go the way of places like Zambia and Malawi, which were, in his view, kind of, if not failed states, horribly corrupt Marxist ones. That was what Ian Smith said. And lo and behold, the West put sanctions on Rhodesia. The only people that would help Rhodesia were initially the Portuguese, but then they stopped. They were essentially isolated except for help from South Africa, which didn't help their case with the rest of the world because South Africa did have a deliberately apartheid state. And we're not going to get into that conversation for the purposes right now. Rhodesia fought an incredibly successful Bush war. They essentially won every battle that they had. They launched what was probably the most effective counterinsurgency campaign that ultimately ended up not being successful, but not as a result of military failures on the ground. The Selous Scouts are regularly held up. Like anybody that can look at if they can take away the political side and just look at the way that the Selous Scouts operated in Rhodesia, you actually come up with, I mean, they were incredible. They were highly effective. There was reports of like an 80-1 kill rate between Rhodesian armed forces and the various communist-backed militias that they were fighting. So that's, again, regardless of what you think about the various sides in this war, no question that they were an incredibly effective military force. What eventually happened over time was that with cutoff from the rest of the world, not being able to get munitions, not being able to get petrol, it eventually came to the point where Ian Smith recognized that they were going to need to compromise. They had a compromise that they offered in 71, which allowed for it still kept it wasn't absolute majority rule, but it allowed for more participation of the native population. As soon as they open it up to a point where Mugabe, I'll just put it this way. I'll make it long story short. Mugabe ends up winning. Mugabe is leading kind of a coalition of the various Marxist militias that were involved, because there was actually two kind of like the Marxist militias were separated by about tribal lines. Mugabe wins. Mugabe initially says, hey, I don't want retributions against the whites. That's what he claimed. Him and Ian Smith was still kind of the leader of the opposition. And, Mugabe claimed that what they were going to do was he wanted to understand what the whites wanted, but there was going to be massive land reforms. There was going to be other reforms that took place. The end result is Mugabe ended up ruling somewhat as a Marxist, as an authoritarian Marxist. He imposed one-party rule. He essentially confiscated large swaths of property from the whites and kind of kicked out the white farmers. And so the revisionist take is, Ian Smith was basically right, that by them saying you got to have a certain education level and a certain degree of wealth, which is to say that they didn't want people that were coming in to say, I want to vote, to basically just steal, confiscate, and redistribute property. And so the protections they put in place for the system that they had was you had to reach a certain education level. You had to be basically self-sufficient with respect to your own income. And that was seen as a bulwark against this idea of, we don't want a Marxist militia to come in and appeal to people that if you put us in charge, we'll take everybody's land and give it to you instead. Okay. He lost. And Mugabe came in, and initially it wasn't purges right away. But then you saw Mugabe purging other political opposition, kicking out the white farmers. Zimbabwe essentially became a failed state. Their inflation level reached 79 billion% or something.
I mean, they were printing $100 trillion bills.
Yeah, I have $100 trillion Zimbabwe. In fact, I think we got a picture of a $100 trillion Zimbabwe note.
No, but I can pull one up
okay,
if you give me just a second.
So I had a $100 trillion Zimbabwe note. you had complete collapse. What had once been the breadbasket of Africa was now having to import food in order to prevent famine. Yeah, there's a picture of $100 trillion. That was literally not worth the paper it was printed on. I think they actually had to pass a law that made it illegal to burn Zimbabwe currency for warmth. Like it was, you saw these comical pictures of people walking around with barrelfuls, like wheelbarrow fulls.
Yeah, it's like full Weimar.
Yeah, Zimbabwe dollars that were absolutely worthless and couldn't purchase anything. And so basically within 20 years, Zimbabwe had gone from a functioning country with a fairly robust economy, again, robust agricultural industry, robust mining industry, to essentially a failed state with hyperinflation. And so a lot of the revisionists look at that and be like, so what did Ian Smith get wrong? And oh, by the way, this wasn't something where the West just kind of left it alone, right? This is not something where the brave indigenous population just overthrew their evil white oppressors. It was, no, the Soviets came in and directly armed the
Mugabe's
militia, and I forget the name of the other prominent militia. And then they prevented anybody from providing. They wouldn't even prevent the South Africans from, like, there was arms embargoes, and the UK and the United States directly participated in the isolation
tried to force
of Rhodesia.
the collapse. We eventually did.
Yeah.
Ian Smith actually wrote a book after he lost power.
Yeah.
And then he became leader of the opposition, and then eventually Mugabe even forced that out and established basically a one-party Marxist dictatorship. Ian Smith wrote a book later in his life called The Great Betrayal.
Yeah.
And he effectively argues, and I think he does make a good point here, is that the British and Americans betrayed the Rhodesians because they viewed them as just irredeemable racists, white supremacists, and they were making very specific arguments, which is, look, these people, like, Ian Smith was born there.
Yeah.
He said that he wanted to die there. He unfortunately did not get his wish, but his family had lived there for several generations. A lot of the whites had not just moved there. It was like their grandparents or even great-grandparents had settled it.
There was like arguably 4 generations of settlers.
And so out of that 300,000 white population, the vast majority of them felt like that they had no other place that was their home because they had lived there for generations. And their argument is that it goes back to the old British Empire, the white man's burden from Kipling. Their argument is that we came into a sparsely populated area that was pre-technological.
Stone Age.
Basically Stone Age.
It was hunter-gatherer.
I mean, they were living in the bush. This is why it was called the Rhodesian Bush War. And we uplifted the people here to civilization. We built cities where they previously did not exist. We built infrastructure. We built railroads. We built highways. We built schools and hospitals. And then we brought people out of the bush into that civilization and introduced them to it. Some of those people actually performed quite well. This is what left out of it. There was a minority of Black Africans that took quite well to the civilization that the Rhodesians had established and had become integrated into it. There was even a minority of them that fought with the Rhodesians against Mugabe's communist Marxist militia.
Yeah. The Selous Scouts, which again is one of there was black and white.
There were
Rhodesians.
other Black Africans that stuck to their old tribal ways, and the Rhodesians actually respected those old tribal ways. They even provided funding to local tribal chieftains for them to just basically maintain their own existence. And their thought was, they're welcome to stay there in the bush and do their own thing. And if they want to do that, they're welcome to do that. And if they ever want to come into the cities or join the type of civilization that we've built, we'll welcome them in, and they can go through the process. And eventually maybe their kids, their grandkids will become Ian Smith's argument was, it might take a couple hundred years, but eventually we will get to a point where everybody will become assimilated and civilized, and we'll be a first world nation. And then we can actually have transition to majority rule, because it'll be a transition to a civilized majority, is what he said. He used the quote that he wanted to maintain government in civilized hands, and the West interpreted that as white supremacists. And he said, no, here's a good analogy. If you colonized the North Sentinel Island in the Indian Ocean. This is like one of the last
Yeah.
uncontacted tribes. You know, they're literally like living.
They
tens of
attack
thousands of-
anybody that comes
Yeah.
close to them. Yeah.
If you colonized that area, and you set up a government, you set up a civilization, and a minority of those people came in and joined that, you know, left the bush, left the wilderness, the state of nature that the Enlightenment philosophers would talk about,
Yeah.
which is what that is.
Yeah.
And they joined it, and then they became educated in, you know, in the type of Western education that we have in Europe or in the US. Then those that assimilated and became civilized would be totally under the Rhodesian system, were totally eligible to participate in the political system. Yes, you're talking about a tiny minority, you know, 1%, less than 1%. But the idea was that over time, more and more of them would go through that process. And those that didn't want to, well, as long as they weren't murdering people or acting like total savages and killing people, they can practice their traditional tribal system as much as they want. That was the system that they had, but that wasn't good enough for Marxist agitators,
Well, so,
or for liberal. This is the
Yeah.
thing that's really left out. Or for liberals that have this blank slate egalitarian view of humanity that we're all just, you know, we're all English liberals. No, you're not. Like the story of Rhodesia proves that the liberal conception of humanity is false. It is false. We are not all blank slate egalitarians. Some people don't want to be liberals either. Some people don't want to be English. Some minority groups might. There were objectively examples of Black Africans that wanted to be like white Rhodesians, and they did all of those type of things. But not everybody wants that.
So this is the part. This is the part I'm going to push back on a little bit. The revisionist idea that Ian Smith was essentially right about everything, and see, this is what happens when you just decolonize without any sort of real plan. The part that I take exception to is that, and again, you can say that this is part of the classical liberal tradition to some degree, right? It's this idea that human beings and native populations might have a system that they are operating in, that they like, that they prefer, and why is it any of my business to go in and change their system if that's what they want, right? And I think that's generally, when you look at Western values, we, you know, even though we haven't like necessarily operated under that, that tends to be the argument that insofar as someone is being peaceful and it's their property, well, then let them do what they want, right? Obviously, when you look at the whole colonial thing, you have a real moral quandary, because there's this violation of this idea that I'm now coming to your place and changing things. And because I'm technologically, militarily, and economically more powerful than you, I can impose my will, so I'm going to. Right? There's a basic concept of that we look at as almost like theft. You're a burglar. You're coming into my area and you're stealing my stuff because you don't like it, and you think you're right to do it because you got the money and the guns. Right? Like, I get it. I get the moral quandary of that. When we look at what was going on in Rhodesia at the time, I do think it's important to understand that, again, the two primary tribes that the white settlers were operating with in that point, there had been conflicts and there had been resolutions and treaties that had taken place, but both of those tribes had actually kicked out the tribe that had essentially was the earliest inhabitants that we know of, right? Because they were basically at hunter-gatherer status. Right. And so two tribes that were above hunter-gatherer status, because they were engaging in forms of agriculture and things like that. They were more organized. So why did they kick out the other tribe? Because they were more organized and they were economically and militarily superior.
But that's left out of the story, because it's Black Africans doing it to other Black Africans.
That's left out of the story. So the thing that I think the revisionists have a point on with Rhodesia is, would it have been better, not for the ethnically British, would it have been better overall for the vast majority of people living in Rhodesia had it stayed Rhodesia instead of becoming Zimbabwe under Mugabe? And it's really hard to not come to the conclusion that, yeah, it almost certainly would have been. Now, does that mean, what does that mean for us? And I think this kind of goes into the last part that we're going to talk about here, is why is all of this relevant? Why is all of this revisionist history important? Is because as you look at each one of these, there's a certain narrative that all of us have kind of grown up with and just assumed is true. And that narrative is largely rooted in our history and our idea of what that history means and what it explains to us. And now we're going back and we're questioning certain things. Why are we questioning it? Because of what we see happening within our civilization, the civilization that I think most of the people sitting at this table, we're very proud of America. We're proud of our history and the cultural and historical and philosophical and religious traditions, which made it possible. And yet we're watching what's going on in our own country going, something went wrong. How did we get to drag queens? How do we get to a point where the most powerful, technologically advanced, richest nation in the world, who we're proud of, has a major political party advocating to drug up gender-confused 9-year-olds? And we're treating it, we're not treating that as like, well, this is a difficult situation that we have to deal with and perhaps, no. They're treating it as if it's a morally superior view to take, that you should trans kids, that you should celebrate abortion as the height of female empowerment, that you should be pushing for the sort of stuff that Mamdani is right now in New York City with collectivization. It's like, and we are sitting here in the West going, what we believed about ourselves, something's off. And so what are we doing? We're going back into our past and we're trying to make sense of it. Where did things go wrong? And inevitably, when you take that journey, you're going to have some people that make good conclusions and you're going to have some people that make really, really dangerous conclusions. I think we're at a point right now where you have certain people on the right. If the one thing that unifies the right, it's that we're opposed to woke. Critical theory, Marxism, we're opposed that we know we're opposed to it. The problem is the right is going around right now asking, so what do we believe in? And the people on the right that have said, well, we believe in representative government and we believed in individualism and we believe in inherent rights and we believe in decentralization of political power and there's other people right going, okay, and we had all those things, and what happened? Well, you can't possibly say that what we should have done is X, Y, and Z, and what that subset of the right is going is, I don't know that I'm saying that yet, but I do know that you're not going to shut me up by just saying that the solution is classical liberalism. Classical liberalism, now to what degree classical liberalism led us to this point, we can debate.
And we have.
You and I have. And you and I have different opinions on this. But there's no question that if you look at the Enlightenment, if you look at the people that were arguing for classical liberalism, because for every John Locke, who I admire, you have a Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who I can't stand. But there are similarities in the tradition that they come from. And so that's the debate that's going forward. And what we decide about our own history is going to indicate a lot about what happens next. And I desperately don't want a revisionist view of history that says, well, the Nazis were bad, but at least they weren't woke. No, the Nazis were evil, full stop. Two things can be true at once. Right? I don't want a revisionist history that says, well, if Franco beat the communists in Spain, that's all I need to know about him. No, the atrocities that were launched by the White Terror were horrible. The atrocities that were launched by the Red Terror in Spain was also horrible. And no, I didn't want the Reds to win that fight. But that doesn't mean I have to concede that whatever Franco did was therefore okay and justified as a result. But then you get into some place like Rhodesia and it's like, man, I get it. I get the frustration with this idea that a foreign population came here, settled there, established civilization. Now, again, that's also a contentious term. Are we saying that civilization is only that which the West defines it as, which is cities and roads and trains? Or can civilization also take on other characteristics that maybe aren't as economically or socially developed, but still be civilization?
I mean, you can certainly make the argument that, well, maybe colonization should have never happened on that grounds, but that's a very different argument than the leftist take on colonization, which is this is evil and bad. And there's a right-wing critique of colonization, which is that these people should have just been left to themselves, and what business is it that the Europeans show up and do anything at all? But again, I mean, that's what we've done with North Sentinel Island, and I would argue that the people there, in many respects, have actually been deprived the benefits that come along with what we would call civilization or westernization. And by the way, it's not as if the West is the only civilization that's ever popped up. I mean, China has a history that goes back thousands and thousands of years. Japan as well. These are, and nobody can argue. I mean, China's had difficult times, of course, right? But nobody can argue that Chinese civilization is not a civilization in its own right? I mean, Japan is a first world country. And that's another example.
No, Chinese civilization has been one of the most fascinating things to research and learn from, precisely because of how long it's been able to endure while maintaining unique characteristics associated with it.
But I do think that there's difference. Like, this is a taboo topic, but I don't think it's an either or, in the sense that how do I put it like this? Group differences exist, but the existence of group differences does not negate the fact that individuals are individuals. Mm-hmm. And so in the case of the Chinese and Japanese, they had a history of largely isolationism, right? The Chinese were the Middle Kingdom. They had the opportunity in the past to go out there and explore the world and maybe even colonize it. They certainly had the population,
they had the fleet,
but they didn't do it. They even burned their fleet eventually. They decided intentionally so to just mind their own business and stick to their little corner of the world. Europeans were never like that. They had this creative drive to go out there, and I mean, that's why they set up America. That's why they ended up colonizing the Americas. That's eventually why they went into Africa and why they went into Asia. They just had this drive to just go out there and see what else was out there and do something with it and make something with it. And yes, that led into conflict, that led into wars. Yeah. But for some reason, there was this impulse that existed within European civilization to do that did not exist within the East Asian countries. And obviously that doesn't mean that every European was like that any more than that means that every single person in East Asia is. And that's why I said
that. Because you can go to the Japanese and they were all about colonization. Once they unified, they're immediately like,
but they only
how do we invade Korea and China?
After the West opened them up.
No.
Like
but don't you think that some of this has something to do with a lot of these European nations? I mean, you look at how big they are on the map. And going to explore in order to conquest meant you got to get in a boat and you got to go places. Or you've got to go barging right through other countries that you're connected to. But can I ask a question, okay, before? Okay. Do you think that sometimes people are conflating negatives with conquest versus colonization? Now, conquest happened and then the colonization followed, but I tend to think that because we view conquest as wrong, then everything that comes after the conquest is wrong.
Yeah.
And so, but it's almost like we've all been conditioned to believe that viewing one cultural habit or one group of ideas that everyone has gathered around, right? I mean, what the definition of culture is basically that this group has come up with ideas as to how to best serve their population, right? And answer questions about existence and everything else. And sometimes people come up with the wrong answers. And sometimes those cultures become very violent because they've decided that this is part of their culture. And I think people view it as being wrong to say that one culture is better than another.
And I think that's where the disagreement comes from.
But that's the problem, is that there are certain systems that work better than other systems for whichever outcome you're looking for. Now, if your outcome is to exterminate anyone that disagrees with you, well, there's a certain answer for that. And if your culture subscribes to that, then you're going to choose that answer.
Here's a good example. I think that the left has this idea that all cultures are equal and that everybody's a blank slate egalitarian, which means that everybody will just become a progressive if we indoctrinate them into progressivism well enough. And this is also why the left has started to marry itself with neoconservatism and nation building and stuff like that. I think both of those views are naive at best and dangerously false at worst.
Well, because ultimately it's just ideas, and not all ideas are equal. Well, and so if we could just boil it down to, well, this is the idea that this group thinks is good. Like it's not good. This other idea is better, meaning this culture is now better than that culture. it doesn't mean the people are worse. It means the ideas they've embraced are worse.
The best example I can give is, I'm sorry, but the culture of Spain is absolutely superior to the Aztecs.
Mm-hmm.
No doubt in my mind. You can criticize all you want about like the Spanish slave trade and the colonization and everything, but I will I will defend to the death the idea that the type of culture that the Spanish practiced was categorically superior to the one that the Mayans practiced.
Uh-huh.
I think that the type of culture that the British practiced was categorically superior than the one that the Indians practiced. Like with sati, for example, the burning of the widow. Like, no, when the British came into India, they outlawed that. Yeah. And they said, we will execute people that are trying to push this because we think it's barbarism. Mm-hmm. And again, the left can look at this today and be like, oh, this is Western chauvinism. So what?
Well, okay, except for the fact that what the West right now is pushing all of this drag queen story hour woke nonsense.
Because the left is committing suicide now.
Okay, but hold on. The West's biggest export is woke. I think you said that. And that is absolutely true. And so me saying there are cultures, some cultures that are better than others. Well, this culture we are currently a part of is worse now than some of the most, I don't know. There are some cultures. Well, when you watch Matt Walsh's What is a Woman?
Yeah.
He went over to Africa to ask these tribes.
And they were like, we don't ask this question.
And so it's like, okay, see, in the past, you would have said, oh, you know, a culture which has, you know, issues in their government and violence and things like that. Well, our culture is better than that. Now you're looking at, well, they want to mutilate the healthy body parts of children in our own culture. That is very inferior.
Oh, I look at it. It's interesting because we will look at things when we go back to antiquity, especially. So let's look at Carthage. Carthaginians came from Phoenicia. Phoenicians believed in child sacrifice. In fact, they were very big on human sacrifice in general, but they were big on child sacrifice. And we look at it now and we say, oh, well, that's ridiculous because they have these absurd religious notions that if they sacrifice their child, it could theoretically help with crops or fertility or whatever else it might be. We don't believe in that. No, we believe in other forms of child sacrifice.
Yeah, abortion's absolutely child sacrifice.
Well, and I don't want to say that flippantly. I want to say let's talk about what sacrifice is. Sacrifice is I can't have two things at the same time, so I give up the thing that's less valuable to me in order to get the other thing that's more valuable to me. Right?
Yeah. I've got a scholarship and I'm pregnant. Well, I'm going to lose the scholarship. It's the scholarship or the baby. I'm going to give up the baby because I want the scholarship. That's a sacrifice.
So the idea was the Carthaginians or the Canaanites or whoever else it was or the Aztecs. You could certainly look at it and say, well, that's really a backwards scientific way to look at, you know, how to affect crop rotations or how to affect, the agricultural output, right? Or whether or not the sun was going to be eaten. But you could at least forgive the fact that in some cases they thought they were dealing with an existential threat to their existence. The existential threat was if we don't appease the gods, we'll die. What do we sacrifice kids for?
Well, people treat themselves as gods now. And
and that's been, okay, so again, to your point about the whole cultural component here, right? I think there is an arrogance that we have in the West of assuming that we have just got this all figured out through this lens of a very, very hyper-secular humanism, which says that we are the pinnacle of civilization as human beings, and our needs, wants, desires, our self-actualization, as Maslow would describe it, it is paramount. It's our primary concern, combined with maybe a hyper-egalitarianism.
There's nothing higher to appeal to than our own individual appetites.
And I think what we're seeing is that what the right is now saying is I liked aspects of classical liberalism, provided it was within a certain moral framework. Well, the framework has been eroded over the last several decades. And now you have a version of classical liberalism which sits with its feet firmly planted in midair. And what we find is that without that, there's nothing to sustain it. And this is the part where you see, I believe, a return to religion, a return to history to look at where did things go wrong. And I think that the conclusion that a lot of people on the right are coming to is that the conclusion came with maybe egalitarianism. And so you'll see people start to question, they're reopening racial questions that we all thought were dead. And which I wish were dead, to be perfectly honest. They're opening up other questions on nature versus nurture. They're opening up other questions about the United States and our system, our Constitution, our political traditions.
These are all messy questions.
They're all very, very messy questions. And what I find interesting, though, is that is going to happen. And what I would encourage people to understand is that if we just say, well, that's revisionism and we ignore it, or we just say, well, the opposite, whoever's lied to me in the past, the opposite of what you've said is true. Well, no, that's not. The opposite of what they said to you can also be a lie. It can also be incorrect. It can also be inaccurate. The question is how do we arrive at truth? And that's the part where when you look at the postmodernist tradition and how it is infiltrated, because once I take away objective truth, now I can engage in complete relativism. Relativism does not lead to social cohesion. It does not lead to high trust societies. It does not lead to peaceful societies, right? This interpretation of Karl Popper that, the problem that we have is that people are too obsessed with objective truth. I find it so fascinating that the older I get, the more convinced I become by the verse in the Bible which says, and the truth will set you free. It doesn't say, and the truth will make everything easy for you. It doesn't say, and the truth will, create an environment where you're wonderful and secure and prosperous. No, it'll set you free.
Well,
why? Because there is something that comes from this idea of understanding that this is true whether I like it or not. And it doesn't become true based on the degree of how much I approve of it. It's just true. And my obligation is in so far that something is objectively true or morally true, is to adjust my needs and wants and desires to conform with that which is true, as opposed to insist that the moment I'm upset and my quest for self-actualization, all of society has created a great injustice against me, and now I must rebel against it. And yet, that mindset of if I don't get approval for what I want, for my self-actualization, for my individual, if I don't get approval for that, it's not that something's wrong with me, it's something's wrong with everybody else.
We need to conform the truth to my flippant individual desires. That really is the definition of the left. Like, and you know why Popper made this argument? The truth is dangerous. These are these are dangerous things. Well, because if something is objectively true, that means that other things are objectively false, and that means that you then can engage in value judgments against whether or not something is true or false. But value judgments, by definition, are discriminatory.
Yeah.
Right? And so therefore, immediately you find yourself in a position against the concept of the open society. Yeah. The open society can't tolerate the existence of an objective truth. It can tolerate the existence of individual desires and wants.
Yeah.
And the reframing of truth to conform with those individual desires and wants. But the idea that there might be something that commands your allegiance or your respect or for you to conform to it rather than it to conform to you, that is absolutely antithetical to the modern liberal, I would argue, to liberalism itself, certainly divorced of a religious framework, which is why it's crazy. There's a lot of liberals throughout history that, they get a bad rap on the dissonant right, but in many respects they warned about this. Like, John Locke warned about atheism. He wanted to outlaw atheism. John Rawls warned about comprehensive liberalism, and he defined that as separate from political liberalism. And he defined political liberalism in the same way that a classical liberal typically would. And he said, like, comprehensive liberalism is bad. We don't want that. In fact, I'm drawing a distinction between these two things. Well, now look at where we are. That distinction is vanished. If you want a good idea of what the left is going to argue for, 5 minutes from now, just apply the comprehensive liberal framework, and that will tell you exactly what they're going to argue for.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's, Connor asked a question, goes, in 2 minutes or less, good luck, Connor. What's a personal example of countering revisionism with truth and grace? So I think there's actually a misunderstanding in what we're talking about here. I'm not trying to counter revisionism. there's times when revisionism is totally appropriate and accurate and actually gives you a truer rendition of what took place than what you were told. So it's not that I think revisionism in and of itself is bad. The question is what's true? And so to your question, when somebody maybe asks like, well, Churchill didn't save anything. I'll say, okay, well, can you please give me your definition of what you think he should have saved, what you think he should have done different, and what you might have done different in that particular case. And a lot of times what you find is people haven't really thought about that. What they've done is they've looked back on history with the benefit of several decades, and they're now coming to certain conclusions about what somebody should have done in that moment with far less information. And so that's one of the ways that I will try to judge between revisionism that I think is looking at something from maybe a new perspective or maybe with new information versus somebody that is just simply holding their fist up at the past saying, why couldn't you have been, perfect? I mean, after all, I had all this information of what happened next. I would have never done what you did. You didn't know what they knew at the time or what they were facing at the time. So that's the way I will combat a question on revision that I think is bad revisionism. But that's what I think what I'm concluding through all of this as I look at the right as doing revision is I understand why they're doing it. I think in some respects it's positive, right? But it's the question, what's good revision, what's bad revision? When Tucker Carlson goes, Winston Churchill was a failure because he didn't protect anything, so therefore he's not just a failure, he's a bad guy. Okay, Tucker, so if things don't go the way you want, any of the work that you did to try to change it is not only is it not sufficient to say that you were successful, it's not sufficient to say that you were even fighting for it. Does the absence of victory mean that you weren't fighting for something? Of course not. That's stupid. That doesn't even make sense. That doesn't even follow. And yet that's the sort of argument I see being made by the right. Well, he said he's held up as this defender of Western civilization, but 40 years after he died, there's drag queen story hours, so he's a failure. Okay, well, I'm pretty sure what he was fighting for in that particular moment was to make sure that the Nazis didn't occupy Great Britain. Did they? Okay, well, then I guess he was relatively successful at what he was attempting to do with respect to the fight that he had in that particular moment. And then guess what? He tried to continue on fighting politically. He lost an election. Does that mean that he shouldn't be venerated for the successes that he had? And again, would you like to be judged by that same criteria, Tucker? This is we're not going to go into it deeply here, but when you talk about things like, Candace Owens, who is now saying, well, firebombing to Dresden, or they're dropping the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Look at all the civilians we killed. Like, I get it. I get that there is a moral question that does need to be debated there. But if you're not willing to factor in that part of that moral question is we were fighting a war we didn't start with an empire that engaged in the raping of Nanking, and that we had produced so many Purple Hearts in preparation of the invasion of the Japanese home islands that we're still using those Purple Hearts today. We haven't ran out because of what the casualties would look like. So, okay, I get it. You think we should have done something else. But the bottom line is that people were making decisions based off the information they had at the time and with the full weight of the potential consequences of getting it wrong. That's another part that I have noticed that when it comes to historical revisionism, the people that are the most bold in their pronouncements are the ones that have never occupied any position within their life for which they have had to make important decisions which could cost the lives of others. They're podcasters. They're historians. Now, most of the historians in the traditional sense are actually a little bit more humble than the people that I see in a lot of these podcasts now, the Daryl Coopers of the world. But when you've been in a position where the decision I make next might get somebody else killed, you think about it very differently. When you are sitting from the comfort of a studio or a library or a university, that's not to say that those people can't provide important and useful insights. John Keegan is one of my favorite historians. I think he's one of the best historians ever. I think that guy has all kinds of insights into history that are incredibly valuable for civilization. But I've noticed that he makes these pronouncements or he comes up with these insights through a certain degree of humility that I don't see being demonstrated by Tucker Carlson or Candace Owens. They think the humility is in entertaining the revision. The humility is not making the mistake that people do who deify the people that are useful for them with respect to their current self-image. I've always once said that if you really want to appreciate the founding fathers, don't deify them. And here's what you're going to find. They were flawed individuals, but it actually makes the wonderful things they accomplished more incredible. Because if they were just all powerful gods with perfect knowledge of what the end state would look like, that would actually diminish what they actually were able to accomplish in less than perfect circumstances. So, I don't know. I hope that, hope that answers that question. Here's the last thing. I'll go and give my 2 minutes, and then I'll let everybody say. I would say that, again, going back to all of this, I think the revisionism, the revisionist, or the reimagining, maybe we'll put it that way, the reimagining of history and what got us to this point is both important and necessary. But what's really important is that we actually have a process whereby we can analyze these things in a way that respects objective truth and objective morality. And I fear what's happening is the right is saying, nope, we're in an existential threat with the left right now. And so I'm not interested in viewing history in an idea of what was true or what was objectively moral. I'm interested in revising it based off of what is useful to the fight right now. Here's the one thing I'll warn about on that. I understand things getting to a point where winning at all costs seems to be the only thing to consider. There is a way to win a fight where you completely lose any vestige of what you were fighting for. I don't want to do that. I am hoping that the right will start to do a better job of talking about what it is that we want, and not just what it is that we oppose. And that conversation is going to have to be fairly comprehensive, and we're not going to have perfect agreement on everything. But if there isn't some basic agreement on the right of these are the objective moral standards, these are the processes that we use to arrive at truth, and these are the things that we believe in and we're willing to fight for and we're willing to die for. If we're not willing to establish that, then what will end up happening is you will see a fracturing of the right where it just becomes picking up whatever tool we find useful in the moment to defeat the enemy that's standing in front of us. And there have been some pretty bad tools picked up in order to try to do that. And there is a point. There is a point where I will say this. My first and abiding allegiance is to Christ. I love my country. I love our Constitution. There's a lot of things I want to fight for to preserve. There are certain things that I cannot participate in for the purpose of protecting current political structures. I have to first and foremost be fighting in a way that I believe is obedient to the foundation of my worldview, which is Christianity. And so my hope is that as we go through this process of reevaluating, I hope we can stay loyal to the beliefs and the truth, which I think is most critical upon which you build civilization. Because you will build upon the ruins of whatever gets destroyed. So, there's my take.
My answer to Connor's question is, I think that the solution to wokeism is not the Third Reich, it's the First Reich.
Oh, gosh.
The HRE.
I get it, but nobody else is going
to get that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, okay, so
we've talked about this.
I thought it was a funny play on words, but for those that don't understand the history, the Nazis called themselves the Third Reich. The Second Reich is the German Empire that was defeated in World War I. And the First Reich was the Holy Roman Empire that lasted from Charlemagne all the way until Napoleon won at Austerlitz, basically. And it was almost immediately after that the Austrians dissolved it. And what I mean by that, see, I thought it was a funny play on words, but now I'm having to explain it. What I mean by that is, I totally agree with you that it is not sufficient to simply negate something that is false.
Yeah.
Because you can counter a lie with a lie just as easily as you can counter it with the truth. And there's a million lies out there, but there's only one truth. That's not liberal. That's still going to be unpopular, certainly in today's day and age and in today's political and social climate, because it's not liberal. It's antithetical to the open society, because you're saying this is true, this is false, this is good, this is evil. Those are all value judgments, which is the thing that horrifies the left more than anything else. But in terms of constructing that positive vision, I think it's actually incredibly dangerous to counter something that is false and incredibly self-destructive with just a pure negation of it. I actually would argue that that's what we're currently living in right now. I think that that's what wokeism is. I think wokeism in many respects is Christianity divorced from Christ. It's a lot of, I've said this before, right? It's like a lot of Christian morality divorced from a Christ figure. And so there's no redemption, there's no grace, there's just eternal apologizing for your toxic masculinity and your whiteness.
Yeah.
And a lot of that has been constructed as a counter, as a negation of Nazism and fascism and World War II and everything, all the horrors that took place in the 20th century. And we are now living through the consequences of a world that is built upon a lie that's just a negation of something else. It's a reaction to something else. What we need to get back to is ultimately, this is unsettling stuff, but politics is theological inherently. And so if your response to a Satanist construction of politics, well, it could just be another form of Satanism, right? Like you can't construct metaphysics. You kind of have to receive it. And so there has to be a return to some of these like first questions and answering these first questions. And in many respects, like, you know, I can't remember who said it, but somebody once said that eventually we will come around to answering or discovering answers to questions we previously knew. Yeah. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that. It's crazy, but I do think we have to rediscover, you know, answers to questions that we previously didn't even have to ask before, and that's scary and unsettling. And a lot of that is going to require revisionist history. But we also have to understand that, and through that process of revising history, there's going to be some revisionist takes that are false, and there's going to be some revisionist takes that are correct. And just because something is a negation of what we've been told, of a bunch of lies that liberal progressives have told us our whole lives, does not mean that that itself will be true.
Yeah.
That's a whole nother process that we have to uncover what the truth is and not construct it. It cannot be man-made. It has to be, I would argue, divinely ordained. And once we rediscover what that truth is, then we can get around to the fun part, which is how do we allow that truth to influence the way that we organize things like political structures, the way that we organize society, the way that you interact with the world, and the way that you conduct yourself as a man or as a woman. I actually find that part to be not scary at all. I find that part to be the kind of the fun part to come, but we have to get through a lot of the messy stuff first before we can get to that.
All right. We're running up on 3 hours, so
Gosh,
I don't
just
think
like,
there's
buy more
anything
bullets.
I can add.
Okay.
Buy more bullets.
Yeah. All right. Well, once again, we know this was kind of a long one. Maybe we should have just gone with 2 examples, but we really wanted to do the 3 because I thought it did a better job of kind of hammering out all the issues that we wanted to talk about on this whole question of revisionist history and what makes for good revisionist history and what makes for bad revisionist history. So once again, thank you very much for joining. We hope you had a great time, and we look forward to seeing you next episode.